Hey guys, tonight we descend beneath the earth itself, where torchlight flickers against walls carved by desperate hands, where entire families huddled in silence while invaders thundered across the ground above their heads, and where the very soil became a mother's embrace against a world gone mad with violence. You're about to spend the next little while learning how medieval people, farmers, merchants, mothers, children, transformed themselves into human moles, digging elaborate underground cities that would remain hidden for centuries. And here's your reality check for the evening. If you were dropped into one of these situations without the knowledge these people possessed, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. You'd suffocate from poor ventilation, get lost in labyrinthine passages, or simply panic in the absolute darkness until someone found your very embarrassed remains centuries later. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments. There's something magical about knowing someone in Australia is drifting off while someone in Norway is just settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a field in what will someday be called Turkey, though right now, in this moment, we're imagining it's simply home. The year doesn't matter as much as the feeling, that prickle along your spine that comes when distant dust clouds mean riders are approaching, and not the friendly kind. Your grandmother grabs your wrist with fingers stronger than they look, and she pulls you toward what appears to be an ordinary stone, perhaps a boulder used for sharpening tools, but she knows something you're about to learn. She pushes, the stone rolls with a grinding whisper, and suddenly there's a hole in the earth itself. A passage, a throat leading down into darkness. She doesn't explain, there isn't time. She simply pushes you forward and you descend. This scene, or something very much like it, played out thousands of times across the medieval world. The instinct to burrow, to seek safety beneath the ground, is older than civilization itself. Our distant ancestors slept in caves, not merely for convenience, but because something in our very bones understands that earth means protection. Stone above your head means nothing can swoop down and take you. Walls of packed soil mean the wind cannot find you, the rain cannot touch you, and most importantly, enemies cannot see you. The medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th century to the 15th century, though historians still argue whether those boundaries make any real sense, was not a gentle time. It was an era of constant movement, of peoples pushing against peoples, of empires crumbling and new powers rising from the chaos. For the average person living in a small village, politics meant nothing except when it arrived in the form of armed men demanding grain, livestock, daughters, or blood, sometimes all four. The great castles and fortified cities you've seen in movies were reserved for lords and their retainers. Regular people, the ones who actually grew the food and made the goods, had to find their own solutions, and so they dug. The underground refuges of the medieval world weren't uniform. They ranged from simple escape tunnels barely large enough to crawl through, to elaborate subterranean cities capable of housing tens of thousands of people for months at a time. Some were carved from soft volcanic rock that could be worked almost like firm cheese. Others were excavated from limestone, chalk or clay, each material demanding different techniques and offering different advantages. The builders weren't architects in any formal sense. They were farmers who happened to notice that the rock beneath their fields could be hollowed out. They were villagers who remembered stories from their grandparents about the old hiding places. They were desperate people doing desperate things, and somehow through trial and error, and probably quite a few tragic collapses, they figured it out. What makes these underground refugees so fascinating isn't just their existence, it's their sophistication. You might imagine medieval people as simple folk with simple solutions, but the engineering that went into some of these complexes would challenge modern builders. Ventilation shafts that could be sealed against smoke attacks while still providing fresh air. Water systems that tapped into underground springs or collected rainfall through ingenious channels. Defensive mechanisms that would make a Bond villain nod in appreciation. These weren't crude holes in the ground. They were survival machines, refined over generations. Historians still argue whether the earliest of these refuges were built for protection against human enemies or natural disasters, or perhaps something else entirely. Some scholars suggest religious motivations, that early Christian communities in hostile territories carved out underground churches and living spaces to practice their faith in secret. Others point to economic factors, noting that underground spaces maintain consistent temperatures ideal for storing wine, grain, and other perishables. The truth, as usual, probably involves all of these factors tangled together in ways we can never fully untangle. But for tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow and let your breathing slow, we're going to focus on the survival aspect, because there's something deeply human about the image of a community working together, season after season, generation after generation, to carve safety from the earth itself. They couldn't build walls high enough to stop armies. They couldn't afford the weapons to fight back, but they could disappear. They could become ghosts. They could wait in the darkness until the storm passed overhead, then emerge blinking into sunlight to rebuild whatever had been destroyed. You're going to learn how they chose where to dig, what tools they used, how they kept from suffocating or going mad in the darkness. You're going to explore specific sites, Cappadocia's legendary underground cities, the mysterious souterrains of Ireland and Scotland, the troglodyte villages of France, even the hidden caves beneath the streets of modern Nottingham. You're going to meet the people who lived in these spaces, who gave birth in them, who died in them, who carved prayers into stone walls by the light of oil lamps that had to be carefully rationed because running out of light underground was a terror beyond description. And somewhere along the way, if I do my job right, you're going to feel your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts grow soft, and you're going to drift off knowing that humanity has always found ways to survive, that ingenuity and community can overcome even the darkest times, and that somewhere beneath the ground you're lying on right now, there might be passages no one has discovered yet, silent testimonies to ancestors who refuse to give up. The earth remembers. It keeps its secrets well. But tonight, we're going to listen to some of the stories it has to tell. The soft volcanic landscape of central Anatolia didn't create underground cities by accident. It invited them. But Anatolia was hardly alone. All across the medieval world, certain regions developed rich traditions of subterranean refuge, and the pattern wasn't random. It followed the paths of invasion, the routes of raiders, the fault lines where civilizations collided, and ordinary people got crushed in between. You find yourself now standing on a map, if you can imagine such a thing, looking down at medieval Europe and the lands beyond as if from a great height. The Roman Empire has crumbled, or rather, it's still crumbling, a slow-motion collapse that would take centuries to complete in the east. Into the vacuum rush peoples with names that sound like weather events: Goths, Vandals, Huns, Avars, Bulgars. Later come the Arabs, expanding with breathtaking speed in the 7th and 8th centuries. Later still the Mongols, whose reputation preceded them like a shockwave. For people living in the path of these movements, the question wasn't whether violence would come, but when. The geography of fear wasn't evenly distributed. Coastal regions faced different threats than inland valleys. Mountain communities had natural defences that plain dwellers lacked. River routes that brought trade also brought raiders who understood that wealth flows along water. If you lived in certain unlucky corridors, the Anatolian Plateau, the plains of Hungary, the exposed coastlines of the Mediterranean, your ancestors had probably been killed, enslaved, or displaced multiple times before you were born. This wasn't paranoia, this was inherited knowledge written in scar tissue. Central Anatolia in what's now Turkey became perhaps the most elaborate laboratory for underground survival. The region sat at a crossroads, quite literally, as the old Silk Road passed through, which meant wealth and danger in equal measure. Persian armies had marched through, Alexander the Great had marched through, Roman legions had marched through, Arab cavalry would march through. The people who lived there couldn't march anywhere. They were tied to their land, their farms, their families, so they went down instead of away. But the Anatolian solution required a specific geological gift: tuff. This volcanic rock, created by ancient eruptions and compressed ash, was soft enough to carve when freshly exposed but hardened when exposed to air. It was porous enough to breathe, literally, allowing air to pass through in ways that kept underground spaces from becoming tombs. And it was abundant, lying just beneath the surface across vast stretches of the Cappadocian region. Without tuff, the underground cities couldn't have existed. The Earth itself had to cooperate with human desperation. Similar geological luck blessed other regions. The chalk deposits of northern France and southern England could be excavated with relative ease. The limestone of the Mediterranean basin, while harder than tuff, could be worked by patient hands over time. The sandstone beneath Nottingham in England proved surprisingly cooperative. In each case, the presence of workable stone combined with the presence of threats to create the conditions for underground building. Ireland and Scotland present a different pattern. The souterrains found throughout these Celtic lands weren't carved from soft rock. They were often built from stones carefully fitted together, then buried under earthen mounds. The construction technique differed, but the impulse was the same: create hidden spaces where people and valuables could vanish when danger approached. Historians still argue whether these structures were primarily defensive, religious, or perhaps served as cold storage. The Irish climate made underground chambers excellent natural refrigerators, after all. The honest answer is probably that they served all these purposes at different times, because medieval people were practical above all else. The Loire Valley of France developed yet another variation. Here, the soft tufa stone, similar to Anatolian tuff but geologically distinct, allowed entire communities to carve homes directly into cliff faces. These weren't strictly underground, but they partook of the same logic. Use the earth itself as shelter, blend into the landscape, become invisible to those who meant harm. During the 100 Years' War, when English and French armies tore the countryside apart in cycles of destruction, these troglodyte villages offered protection that surface dwellings couldn't match. You might notice a pattern forming here. The regions that developed the most sophisticated underground refuges weren't the most technologically advanced or the wealthiest. They were the most vulnerable. They were the places where running wasn't an option, where walls were too expensive, where the only resource available in abundance was the earth itself and the determination to survive. Necessity mothered invention, as the saying goes, but desperation was the father. There's something darkly humorous about the fact that some of the world's most impressive architectural achievements were built by people trying to disappear. The pyramids of Egypt were meant to be seen forever, monuments to power that dominated the landscape. The underground cities of Cappadocia were meant to be invisible, monuments to powerlessness that vanished into the landscape. Yet both represent staggering amounts of human labour and ingenuity. The difference lies only in motivation. Medieval geographers, or scholars in Baghdad, Constantinople and the great monasteries who tried to make sense of the world, occasionally mentioned these underground refuges, though often with bewilderment. Writing about the Cappadocian region, one 10th century Byzantine source described inhabitants who lived like ants beneath the surface. It wasn't meant as a compliment. The educated elites who produced written records generally lived in fortified cities or monasteries, behind walls of stone or walls of faith. The idea of voluntary burial seemed bizarre, even shameful. But the people doing the burying weren't reading those accounts. They were too busy surviving. They passed down knowledge not through manuscripts, but through practice. Father teaching son which rock formations to look for. Mother teaching daughter how to prepare food that would last in underground storage. Entire communities maintaining secrets about entrance locations that were never written down, precisely because writing them down would defeat the purpose. The geography of fear created the geography of refuge, and as you drift through this imagined landscape feeling perhaps the weight of history pressing down like comfortable blankets, you might reflect on how the ground beneath your own feet has its own stories. Every region has its hiding places, its forgotten corners where desperate people once waited out desperate times. The medieval world simply made this impulse into an art form. The soil remembers the hands that dug into it. The stone remembers the tools that shaped it. And somewhere in the darkness below the surface, those memories wait. The old woman in your imagined village kneels beside a particular outcropping of pale rock, and you watch as she scrapes her fingernail across its surface. A groove appears easily, as if the stone were hard cheese rather than anything geological. She nods to herself, satisfied. She's reading the earth like others read scripture, and the message she finds there is one of hope. Here, the ground will yield. Here, we can build our refuge. Choosing where to dig wasn't arbitrary, though to untrained eyes the medieval builders' methods might seem like superstition or guesswork. In reality, these communities developed sophisticated understanding of their local geology, not in the formal terminology of modern science, but in the practical wisdom of people whose lives depended on getting it right. They knew which colours indicated workable stone. They knew which textures meant stability. They knew which formations promised ventilation and which promised death. This knowledge passed down through generations refined by bitter experience. In the Cappadocian region, the volcanic tuff presented a Goldilocks quality that made it ideal for excavation. This rock, formed from volcanic ash compressed over millions of years, combined softness with structural integrity in ways that seem almost designed for underground construction. When you first expose tuff to air, it's soft enough to carve with copper tools, bronze if you're fortunate, iron if you're living in a particularly prosperous period. But something remarkable happens as the rock breathes. It hardens. The exposure to oxygen triggers a chemical transformation that strengthens the stone over time. Medieval builders discovered this property through observation rather than chemistry, but they exploited it brilliantly. The colour of tuff matters too. Darker varieties rich in certain minerals tend to be harder and more brittle. The pale, creamy tuff that dominates the Cappadocian landscape hits the sweet spot, soft enough to carve, strong enough to stand. Communities learn to recognise these variations at a glance, just as a carpenter learns to read wood grain or a baker learns to judge dough by feel. You develop an instinct for your materials when your survival depends on them. Limestone presents different challenges and opportunities. Harder than tuff, limestone required more patience and better tools, but it offered superior stability once carved. The underground quarries beneath Paris, which would later become the famous catacombs, demonstrate what determined medieval workers could accomplish in limestone over time. These spaces weren't primarily refuges, but the same principles applied. Identify stone that could be worked, then work it methodically over years or decades. Chalk, found abundantly in England and northern France, represented perhaps the easiest material to excavate. This soft stone could be cut with simple tools, almost like carving ice that doesn't melt. The catch was structural weakness. Chalk crumbles if you're not careful, and underground chambers in chalk required careful attention to ceiling thickness and pillar placement. The builders who created the chalk caves beneath cities like Norwich and the troglodyte villages of Picardy understood these limitations and worked within them. Clay presented another option, particularly for the simpler souterrains of northern Europe. While you couldn't carve elaborate chambers in clay the way you could in stone, you could dig tunnels that would hold their shape if the clay was dense enough and the water table cooperated. Many Irish souterrains were excavated through boulder clay, a mixture of clay and stones left by ancient glaciers, which provided reasonable stability when handled correctly. But how did medieval builders know what lay beneath the surface before they started digging? They couldn't exactly order geological surveys. The answer involves observation, experimentation, and a certain amount of acceptable risk. Water behaviour provided crucial clues. Where streams cut through hillsides, they exposed cross-sections of underground formations. Erosion patterns revealed what lay beneath. Springs bubbling up indicated porous rock that allowed water movement, sometimes desirable for ensuring water access underground, sometimes dangerous if it meant flooding. Medieval builders walked their lands with observant eyes, reading the landscape for these natural geological tutorials. Test pits served a similar function to modern core samples, if cruder. A community considering a major excavation would dig small exploratory holes to see what they'd encounter. If the stone proved unworkable, too hard, too crumbly, too wet, they'd fill the pit and try elsewhere. The labour investment was significant but trivial compared to beginning a major excavation in the wrong location. Existing features offered guidance too. A natural cave, even a small one, suggested that the surrounding rock could be expanded. An old quarry demonstrated that the stone could be worked. Root cellars that held their shape over years indicated suitable conditions for larger projects. Medieval builders weren't starting from scratch, they were expanding on natural experiments and human precedents. Historians still argue whether certain medieval underground constructions followed formal planning or emerged organically over time. The answer probably varies by site. Some complexes show clear evidence of coordinated design, consistent tunnel widths, systematic room placement, engineering features that only make sense as part of a larger plan. Others seem to have grown haphazardly, room added to room as need arose and stone permitted, the underground equivalent of a house that accumulates additions over generations. The quirky truth is that some of the best underground builders were probably the village eccentrics, the ones who spent too much time poking at rocks and muttering about soil conditions, the ones their neighbours thought slightly odd until the raiders came and suddenly those odd habits meant survival. Every community needs its specialists, even if it doesn't always appreciate them in peacetime. What strikes modern archaeologists most when studying these sites is the sophistication of material knowledge that never got written down. We have extensive medieval treatises on church construction, castle building and military engineering, the projects of the powerful. The underground refugees of ordinary people generated no such documentation. The knowledge existed only in practice, passed from hand to hand, and much of it died with the last generation that needed it. We are left to reconstruct their methods from the evidence they left behind, reading their expertise backward from their accomplishments. You imagine that old woman again, her fingernail scraping across pale stone, and you understand now that she's performing an ancient test. She's carrying knowledge that connects her to grandmothers she never met, to diggers whose names no chronicle recorded. And when she nods and marks this spot for excavation, she's making a promise to descendants she'll never see. Here, they will be safe. Here, the earth will hold. The ground opens its secrets to those patient enough to learn its language. The tools appear simple enough that you might underestimate them. A pick with a head of iron, its wooden handle worn smooth by generations of hands. A chisel whose edge shows the careful marks of repeated sharpening. A basket woven from reeds, its bottom stained dark from carrying countless loads of debris. A small oil lamp, its flame barely bright enough to push back the darkness. These are the implements that carved cities from stone. You're watching now in this imagined past we're sharing, as a crew of villagers begins the day's excavation. There's no ceremony to it, no formal start. Someone descends into the passage with a lamp, and the others follow, carrying tools and water skins, and the quiet determination of people who understand that this work won't be finished in their lifetimes. The children will continue it. The grandchildren will refine it. That's simply how things work here. The pick swings with a rhythm that becomes almost hypnotic once you settle into it. The sound echoes through existing passages, a hollow, chunky percussion that announces to anyone above that work continues below. In times of danger, this noise would stop immediately. Sound carries further than people think, and a working tunnel could betray a hiding place. But in times of relative peace, the picking continues, slowly extending the underground network one basket of debris at a time. Medieval excavation tools reflected the technological limitations of their era, but those limitations were less constraining than modern people might assume. Iron tools, picks, chisels, wedges could be produced by any competent blacksmith, and every village of any size had access to blacksmithing services. Bronze tools, while softer, worked adequately in the softest stone types. Even antler picks, the tool of choice for Neolithic peoples thousands of years earlier, could make progress through chalk and soft tuff if iron wasn't available. The real sophistication lay not in the tools themselves, but in how they were used. Experienced carvers understood that volcanic tuff cut most easily when slightly damp. Moisture softened the stone without weakening it. They learned to work with the natural grain of sedimentary rock rather than against it. They knew that limestone required patient pecking rather than dramatic swings, that trying to remove too much material at once risked cracking formations you hadn't intended to damage. Specialized tools emerged for specific tasks. Narrow chisels carved the ventilation shafts that kept air moving through the passages. Broader tools squared off room corners and smoothed walls. Pointed implements created the small niches that would hold oil lamps. You'll notice these niches in any underground space you visit. Little carved pockets at regular intervals, each one blackened by centuries of smoke from the flames that once burned there. The removal of debris represented as much labour as the excavation itself, possibly more. Every cubic foot of stone carved from the earth had to be carried back to the surface. First in baskets on human backs, later sometimes with the help of simple pulley systems, but always requiring enormous cumulative effort. A single room might generate tons of debris. A complex of rooms and passages generated mountains of it. What happened to all that removed stone? This question reveals one of the clever aspects of the underground construction. The debris wasn't simply dumped in obvious piles that would betray the digging project to observers. Instead, it was distributed, used to reinforce surface buildings, spread across fields where it might be mistaken for natural rock outcropping, sometimes even sold as building material if the community lived near enough to markets. The absence of obvious spoil piles near many underground sites testifies to how carefully builders concealed their work. In Cappadocia, some of the excavated tuff was carved into the blocks and used to build the surface structures that concealed underground entrances. The irony is beautiful. Stone that came out of the earth was stacked above the earth, and the resulting buildings look no different from their neighbours. Raiders searching for hidden refuges might look right at the entrance building without recognising it. Lighting presented constant challenges. Oil lamps, small ceramic dishes holding olive oil or animal fat with a wick floating in it, provided the primary illumination, but oil was precious and smoke was dangerous. Work crews learned to minimise lamp usage, carrying out familiar tasks by feel in near darkness, reserving good light for the delicate carving work that required visual precision. The dark spots on underground ceilings, visible still in many sites, mark where smoke accumulated over centuries of use. Historians still argue whether larger excavation projects employed full-time workers or relied entirely on part-time village labour. The answer probably varied by period and prosperity. During times of acute danger, entire communities might abandon other work to speed the digging. During calmer periods, excavation might continue slowly, a few hours here and there when farm work permitted. Some complexes show evidence of distinct carving styles in different sections, suggesting different crews working different portions, perhaps different generations, perhaps different families responsible for their own designated areas. The generational aspect can't be overstated. Many underground complexes took longer to build than any single human lifespan. Children who began carrying debris baskets as their first contribution would grow old still working on the same project, training their own grandchildren in techniques they themselves had learned as youngsters. The sense of working towards something you would never see completed, contributing to safety you might never personally need. This required a particular mindset, a patience that modern people might find difficult to comprehend. There's a quirky thought experiment historians sometimes enjoy, calculating the total human hours represented by sites like Derinkuyu, the deepest of the Cappadocian underground cities. The numbers become almost absurd. Millions of hours of labour, hundreds of thousands of baskets of debris, enough swings of picks to wear through countless tool heads, all performed without power machinery, without artificial lighting beyond oil flames, without even accurate surveying equipment to ensure that passages connected where they were supposed to connect. And yet they did connect. The passages arrived where they were intended. The rooms achieved their planned dimensions. The ventilation worked. The water systems functioned. Medieval people accomplished with patience and accumulated knowledge what we would accomplish with technology, and in some ways their results were more elegant. Systems that worked with natural principles rather than fighting against them. Structures that lasted centuries rather than decades. You imagine the weight of that pick in your hands, the ache in your shoulders after hours of swinging, the taste of stone dust on your lips. And you understand that every underground passage represents not just engineering but devotion, the accumulated love of countless people for those who would come after them. The darkness down here isn't like the darkness you know. Above ground, even the blackest night offers something. Starlight filtering through clouds, the distant glow of a neighbour's fire, the way your eyes eventually adjust and shadows become shapes. Underground, with your lamp extinguished, the darkness is absolute. It presses against your eyes like a physical weight. You could hold your hand an inch from your face and see nothing, not even the faintest outline. The first time medieval workers experienced this total darkness, some of them must have felt their hearts seize with primal terror. But terror is a luxury in survival situations. You learn to manage it. You learn to work in it. Digging in. Darkness, or near darkness, with oil lamps rationed and positioned for maximum effect, presented psychological challenges that matched the physical ones. Human beings evolved on sunlit savannas. We're creatures of light and open spaces, poorly equipped for the sustained underground existence. The builders of medieval refuges had to overcome millions of years of evolutionary programming just to do their work, and then had to figure out how to do that work safely in conditions that seemed designed to kill them. Ventilation emerged as perhaps the most critical concern. An underground space without adequate airflow becomes a death trap within hours. Carbon dioxide from human breathing accumulates. Oxygen levels drop. The flame of your oil lamp, if you still have one lit, begins to flicker and dim, which serves as your warning. When the flame dies, you're next. Medieval builders lacked any understanding of atmospheric chemistry, but they observed these effects and drew practical conclusions. The solution was simple in concept, but demanding in execution: shafts. Vertical passages cut from the deepest chambers all the way to the surface, allowing air to circulate through the underground complex. The engineering involved calculating where shafts were needed, how wide they should be, how to angle them for maximum airflow. Some complexes featured dozens of ventilation shafts, creating air circulation patterns sophisticated enough that fresh air reached every occupied chamber. In Cappadocia, the ventilation shafts sometimes doubled as wells, allowing access to underground water sources. Other shafts were kept dry and narrow, designed purely for air movement. The builders understood, without modern scientific terminology, that air moves from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, and that temperature differences between underground and surface air could drive circulation. Warm air rises, cool air falls, build your shafts correctly and the earth breathes. But ventilation shafts created defensive vulnerabilities too. An enemy who discovered a shaft opening could pour water, smoke, or worse, into the underground refuge. The response was shaft covers, stone lids that could seal the openings from below when danger threatened, cutting off ventilation temporarily but denying access to attackers. Communities practiced sealing themselves in, timing how long they could survive on stored air before needing to crack the seals for fresh breath. It was a grim arithmetic. Collapse prevention required different considerations. Underground excavation creates stresses in surrounding rock. Remove too much material without adequate support and the ceiling falls. Medieval builders learned through catastrophic trial and error which formations could support wide spans and which demanded narrow passages. They left strategic pillars of unexcavated stone to bear the weight of rock above. They noticed warning signs, small flakes falling from ceilings, cracks appearing in walls, and responded by reducing excavation in troubled areas. The soft tuff of Cappadocia proved remarkably forgiving. Its slight flexibility allowed it to absorb stress without brittle failure, and its self-hardening property meant that freshly carved chambers grew stronger over time. Other materials demanded more caution. Chalk could collapse suddenly, without the warning signs that tuff provided. Clay could shift when water tables changed seasonally. Builders adapted their techniques to their materials, or they died. Historians still argue whether structural failures were common during the main construction periods of underground refuges. The evidence is necessarily incomplete. Collapsed passages tend to remain collapsed, hidden from archaeological investigation. But oral traditions from regions with underground complexes suggest that major collapses were relatively rare, at least during the main occupation periods. Either the builders were genuinely skilled, or survivor bias colours our picture. We see the successes because the failures are buried. The psychological toll operated on a different register entirely. Extended periods underground in cramped passages lit only by flickering oil flames created stresses that no engineering could address. Claustrophobia wasn't yet named as a condition, but its symptoms were real enough. Some people simply couldn't tolerate the underground environment, their hearts racing, their breath coming in gasps, their minds convinced that the walls were closing in. Communities developed ways of managing these responses, keeping the worst affected individuals near entrances, assigning surface tasks to those who couldn't cope with depth, probably some herbal sedation for the truly desperate. Children presented special challenges. Young ones don't understand the need for silence, the importance of conserving lamp oil, the danger of wandering into unfamiliar passages. The underground cities had to be child-proof in a literal sense. Narrow passages that adults could navigate but that children couldn't access alone. Warning markers carved at child eye level. Probably a lot of physical restraint during the most dangerous periods when any noise might betray the hiding place. The working crews who extended the underground complexes developed their own adaptations. They learned to navigate by touch, memorizing the feel of passage walls, counting steps to know their position. They developed call systems, specific sounds that meant specific things, a vocabulary of echoes. They learned to gauge remaining lamp oil by the colour and behaviour of the flame, to stretch their light as far as it could go, and they sang. This detail appears in several accounts of underground communities that, despite the need for silence during actual refuge situations, During peaceful working periods, the excavators sang. The songs echoed through the passages, reaching workers in distant chambers, maintaining connection evens when visibility was zero. The stone absorbed the sound and gave it back changed, resonant, almost alive. Down in the darkness, surrounded by the work of generations, they made music. You imagine that music now, as your own breathing slows. Low voices harmonizing with the ring of metal on stone. A rhythm older than memory. Songs nobody wrote down but everybody knew. And somehow that sounds like the gentlest kind of defiance. The fairy chimneys rise around you like petrified flames, their impossible shapes carved not by human hands but by water and wind over millennia. You're standing in Cappadocia now, in the heart of Anatolia, where the landscape looks like something from a dream that couldn't decide if it wanted to be beautiful or terrifying. Pale, tough formations, some topped with harder caps of basalt, thrust upward from valleys that seem designed by an artist with no regard for geological probability. It's spectacular. It's strange, and beneath your feet completely invisible from where you stand an entire civilization waits. The underground cities of Cappadocia represent human survival architecture at its most extreme. We're not talking about simple tunnels or modest refuges. We're talking about subterranean complexes capable of sheltering tens of thousands of people for months at a time, complete with living quarters, kitchens, stables, churches, schools, wine presses, and ventilation systems sophisticated enough to keep all those people breathing. The scale defies casual belief. Archaeologists have documented at least 200 underground sites in the Cappadocia region, ranging from small shelters that might hide a single family to vast complexes spanning dozens of acres. The most famous, Derinkuyu and Kaimakli, have become tourist destinations, their upper levels mapped and lit with electric lights for modern visitors. But even these studied sites haven't been fully explored. Lower levels remain sealed, flooded, or too unstable for investigation. We may never know the full extent of what lies beneath this strange and beautiful land. The earliest construction likely dates to the Phrygians, or perhaps even earlier. Hittite periods, roughly 1200 BCE, though historians still argue about the timeline. What's clear is that by the Byzantine era, from roughly the 6th to the 11th centuries CE, the underground cities had reached their maximum development. This was when the Arab raids came, wave after wave of cavalry sweeping up from the south, and the Orthodox Christian population of Cappadocia needed every hiding place it could find. The pattern repeated across generations. Arab forces would arrive, typically in spring or summer when travel was easiest. Scouts watching from the fairy chimney formations would spot the approaching dust clouds and send warning. Within hours, within minutes really, once the system was practiced, entire villages would vanish underground. Surface buildings would be stripped of anything valuable and left to the raiders. Hidden entrances would be sealed from within, and the waiting would begin. Imagine it. Thousands of people, their livestock, their stored food, their most precious possessions, all crammed into carved stone chambers. The air thick with the smell of animals and unwashed humanity. The children whimpering, the elderly praying, everyone straining to hear sounds from above that might indicate whether the danger had passed. Days would stretch into weeks. Sometimes the raiders would leave quickly, disappointed by abandoned villages that seemed to hold nothing worth taking. Sometimes they would stay, searching, suspecting, trying to find the entrances they knew must exist. The stone honeycomb nature of these complexes made them incredibly difficult for outsiders to crack. Even if a raider found one entrance, that entrance might lead only to a dead-end chamber, or a decoy passage designed to waste invaders' time. The real living spaces lay deeper, accessible only through hidden doors and narrow passages that could be defended by single individuals against entire armies. The whole system was designed around the principle that knowing a complex existed and actually finding the people inside it were two entirely different problems. One quirky feature of Cappadocian construction was the use of natural fairy chimney formations as ventilation disguises. Those strange rock pillars, carved by erosion into shapes that seem almost architectural, were perfect cover for ventilation shafts. A hole in the top of a fairy chimney could provide air to chambers far below while appearing entirely natural to observers. The landscape itself became camouflage. Wine production continued even underground, perhaps especially underground. The constant cool temperature of deep chambers proved ideal for fermentation and storage, and wine represented both important calories and crucial morale during extended refuge periods. Archaeologists have found stone wine presses in multiple underground cities, their basins still stained dark by grape residue. The image of medieval farmers pressing grapes by lamplight deep beneath the earth while enemies searched for them above has a certain absurd nobility to it. Religious practice structured underground life. The Byzantine Christians who built and maintained these complexes were devout, and they carved churches into the rock with the same care they gave to defensive features. Underground chapels featured carved crosses, niches for icons, and simple altars. Some retained traces of painted decoration, saints and biblical scenes rendered in earth pigments that survived because underground environments protected them from weather and light. Services held in these churches must have resonated with particular intensity. When you're hiding from invaders who want to kill you for your faith, liturgy becomes something more than routine. Historians still argue about the social organisation required to build and maintain these complexes. Were they community efforts with shared governance, or did wealthy families control specific sections? Did religious authorities coordinate construction, or did secular village leadership make the decisions? The physical evidence suggests variety. Some areas show standardised construction that implies central planning, while other sections seem more haphazard, individual chambers carved independently and connected later. Probably both patterns existed at different times and places. What's undeniable is the collective commitment these structures represent. Multiple generations working without certainty of completion carved sanctuaries they hoped their descendants would never need, but knew they probably would. The raids came, the hiding worked, the children grew up and continued the digging, and somewhere in that cycle of threat and response, the underground cities achieved a scale that nobody originally planned. Emergent complexity arising from countless small decisions accumulated over time. You're walking through these passages now in imagination, your hand trailing along walls carved by hands 1,000 years dead. The stone is cool to the touch. The air carries a mineral quality that you'll never forget once you've smelled it. And above your head, far above, the fairy chimneys keep their watch over a landscape that reveals almost nothing of the civilization hidden beneath. 18 floors down. That's how deep Derinkuyu goes, though only 8 levels are currently open to visitors, and even those require a certain tolerance for close spaces and steep stairs. You descend now, leaving behind the sunlit surface, leaving behind the gift shops and tourist groups, leaving behind the modern world entirely as you drop into something ancient and almost incomprehensible. The first level seems manageable. The passages are narrow but not claustrophobic, carved with surprising precision considering the tools available. You notice the lamp niches immediately, small rectangular cavities cut into the walls at regular intervals, each one blackened by centuries of smoke. In their flames, these passages would have flickered with moving shadows, alive with light in a way electric bulbs can't replicate. Stables occupy much of this first level. The ceilings rise higher here than in the living quarters below, accommodating the animals that represented both food security and wealth to medieval communities. Horses, donkeys, cattle, goats, sheep, all would have been led down these ramps when danger approached. The smell must have been extraordinary. But a living cow was worth more than comfort, and underground cattle stayed hidden cattle, unavailable for raiders to seize. The second level contains what archaeologists interpret as missionary schools and study spaces. Here young Byzantine Christians would have learnt their catechism, their reading, their sacred music, all by lamplight in carved chambers that maintained consistent temperature year-round. The walls show evidence of carved seating, benches cut directly from the rock, and small niches that might have held books or manuscripts. Education didn't stop just because the world above had become dangerous. Descending further, you encounter the living quarters. Small rooms branch off main passages, each just large enough for a family to sleep together. Privacy was minimal. These weren't designed for comfortable long-term living, but for survival. You notice the carved platforms that served as sleeping surfaces, raised slightly off the floor to avoid dampness. Some rooms feature small carved cupboards for storage, their empty shelves waiting for possessions that disappeared centuries ago. The communal kitchen areas occupy strategic positions near ventilation shafts. necessary because cooking fires produced smoke that needed somewhere to go. You see the carved basins where food would have been prepared, the fire pits with their blackened stone surrounds, the storage niches where clay vessels once held oil, grain, wine. Feeding thousands of people underground required logistical coordination that would challenge modern event planners, but medieval communities managed it through practiced routines, refined over generations. A church occupies one level, its carved columns supporting a ceiling that mimics above-ground architecture, despite being entirely underground. The altar space remains visible, as do the apse and nave. Early Christians conducted their services here during refugee periods that might last weeks, maintaining spiritual rhythm even as their physical world shrank to carved stone. The acoustics in these underground churches are remarkable. Sound carries clearly but softly, perfect for chanting and prayer. Historians still argue about the total population capacity of Derinkuyu. Estimates range from 10,000 to 50,000 people, depending on assumptions about space allocation and duration of stay. The higher numbers seem incredible until you consider that medieval concepts of personal space differed dramatically from modern standards. People slept packed together. Corridors served as additional living space. Every cubic foot of carved chamber represented excavation labour, and none of it was wasted on luxuries like elbow room. The defensive features become more elaborate as you descend. At multiple points the passages narrow dramatically, forcing any attacker to approach single file through corridors barely wide enough for shoulders. These choke points could be defended by individuals against armies. One determined defender with a spear could hold such a passage indefinitely, while attackers had no room to bring numerical superiority to bear. And then there are the rolling stones. These massive circular boulders, carved from the same tuff as the surrounding walls, could be rolled across passages to seal them completely. The stones weigh anywhere from 200 to 500 kilograms, but they're designed to roll in carved channels, requiring only modest force to move. A small hole in the centre of each stone allowed defenders to stab through with spears at anyone trying to move the stone from the other side. The engineering elegance is almost artistic, simple mechanisms exploiting physical principles in service of survival. A peculiar feature of Derinkuyu involves tunnel connections to neighbouring underground cities, particularly Kaimakli about 5 kilometres away. These connecting passages allowed movement between complexes, providing escape routes if one city was discovered, and additional capacity if one complex couldn't accommodate everyone who needed shelter. The tunnels are narrow, barely crawl spaces in some sections, but they exist, documented though not fully explored. The implications for communication and coordination across villages are staggering. Below the areas open to tourists, the unexplored levels wait. Groundwater has flooded some passages. Structural instability has sealed others. Archaeological investigation proceeds slowly, carefully, revealing new chambers and features with each season of work. We may never know the full extent of what Derinkuyu contains. The people who built it left no written records, and stone keeps its secrets. You climb back up now, level by level, your calves burning from the stairs, your lungs grateful for each breath of fresher air. The exit opens onto sunlight that seems impossibly bright after the underground dimness. You stand blinking, disoriented, imagining families doing the same thing centuries ago, emerging after weeks of hiding, uncertain what they'd find above, hoping their homes still stood, their fields unburned, their neighbours alive. The stone honeycomb beneath your feet remains, 18 floors of human determination carved by hand, waiting for the next time safety requires descent. It may never be needed again for its original purpose, but it stands ready just in case. The entrance is simply gone. You're standing where you know it should be. You've passed through it a dozen times before, you could describe its location in your sleep, but the entrance isn't there. A pile of brush that looks completely natural covers the spot. The rolling stone behind that brush has been pushed into position from the inside. Unless you already knew exactly where to look, you'd walk right past without a second glance. This is the magic of medieval concealment, making something vanish by making it unremarkable. The builders of underground refuges understood a truth that military engineers still grapple with today. The best defence is not being found in the first place. All the defensive features in the world mean nothing if an enemy locates your entrance and settles in for a siege. Better to make the entrance invisible. better to make the enemy believe there's nothing to find. Surface structures played a crucial role in this concealment. The buildings above underground complexes looked identical to their neighbours. Same construction materials, same architectural style, same appearance of ordinary habitation. The entrance might lie beneath a floor hidden by a removable stone. It might connect through a cellar, its portal disguised as a storage alcove. In some cases, the entrance was located inside buildings that would appear too small or too flimsy to contain anything important, precisely because raiders would dismiss them as peasant hovels not worth investigating. False entrances and decoy passages added another layer of deception. A searcher who found one entrance and followed it inward might discover only dead ends and empty chambers, never suspecting that the real refuge lay elsewhere, accessible through a different hidden door. The labour involved in constructing these decoys seems almost wasteful until you consider the stakes. A discovered refuge meant not just capture of goods, but capture of people, families, children. No deception was too elaborate if it kept that from happening. The rolling stone doors deserve particular attention. We've mentioned them already, those massive circular boulders that sealed passages, but the ingenuity of their placement bears closer examination. The stones were carved to fit their channels precisely, creating seals that were nearly airtight when closed. They could only be moved from one side, the inside, meaning that even if attackers understood how the mechanism worked, they couldn't operate it from their position. And the hole in the centre, that small opening just large enough for a spear thrust, allowed defenders to make any attempt to breach the door extremely costly. Some passages featured multiple rolling stones in sequence. Break through one, and you faced another. The cumulative effect transformed narrow corridors into killing zones, where any advance came at brutal cost. Attackers who understood what awaited them often decided that empty villages weren't worth the casualties. Required to breach their hidden refuges, the stones worked as much through deterrence as through actual physical barrier. Concealment extended above ground as well. Ventilation shafts, which we've discussed as engineering necessities, had to be hidden from surface observation. Solutions varied by location. Some shafts opened inside innocuous surface structures, a shed, a stable, an abandoned building. Others emerged in dense vegetation that concealed the openings. In Cappadocia, the natural fairy chimney formations provided perfect concealment. A ventilation chasse opening in the top of a rock pillar was effectively invisible from ground level. Historians still argue whether systematic deception techniques were shared between communities or developed independently in different regions. The similarity of certain features, rolling stone mechanisms, false passages, integrated surface concealment, suggests some knowledge transfer, but the specific implementations vary enough that locals. Innovation clearly played a role too. Medieval information networks were more robust than often assumed, and survival knowledge spread along trade routes and through refugee movements. One quirky technique involved intentional degradation of entrance areas. Rather than keeping hidden doors in pristine condition, builders sometimes allowed or encouraged weathering that made concealed stones blend with their surroundings. Moss growth, dirt accumulation, even deliberate damage that matched natural erosion patterns all contributed to entrances that looked like natural rock formations rather than constructed passages. The patience required for this approach is notable. You had to be willing to wait years for your concealment to mature. Water presented both challenge and opportunity for concealment. Underground streams could expose tunnel locations through surface sinkholes or unusual vegetation patterns. But clever builders could also use water features to mask entrances, placing hidden doors behind waterfalls, accessing passages through underwater channels, using well shafts as dual-purpose entry points. The discomfort of getting wet seemed trivial compared to the security benefits. Communities developed protocols for concealment that matched their physical preparations. Everyone who knew entrance locations understood that betraying that knowledge meant death for neighbours, family, friends. Youth and old enough to understand were taught the importance of secrecy. Those too young to be trusted were simply kept ignorant of entrance locations until they matured. The social enforcement of concealment may have been even more important than the physical measures. A single traitor could undo generations of construction work. The moment of concealment itself, that transition from visible village to empty landscape, must have been practiced until it became almost automatic. When the warning came, every person had tasks. The vulnerable moved toward entrances first. The able-bodied handled livestock and supplies. Designated individuals closed the concealment features in sequence, each doorway, each brush pile, each rolling stone. The last person through performed a final check, ensuring that from outside nothing appeared amiss. And then silence. The village above, abandoned, inviting inspection. The village below, invisible, waiting. You imagine being that last person through, pulling brush over your head as you descend, hearing the grinding sound of stone rolling into place behind you. The commitment of that moment, trusting the concealment completely, trusting the refuge completely, trusting generations of builders you never met. The darkness closes around you and the world above becomes someone else's problem. You take your first breath underground after the rolling stone seals behind you, and the air tastes different. Not bad, not yet, but different. There's a mineral quality to it, something of the stone itself, and beneath that the smell of oil lamps and human bodies and the peculiar organic complexity of livestock. This is the air you'll breathe for however long the danger lasts above. Days, probably. Weeks, possibly. And the only reason you'll breathe at all is because of the ventilation systems that someone carved into this rock generations before you were born. Medieval underground ventilation represents engineering that modern specialists study with genuine respect. Without powered fans, without electrical monitoring systems, without any of the technological advantages we take for granted, these builders created air circulation patterns sophisticated enough to support thousands of people and their animals in enclosed spaces for extended periods. The accomplishment borders on the miraculous. The physics are actually straightforward, though the application required careful observation and accumulated wisdom. Air moves because of pressure differences, and pressure differences arise from temperature variations. Underground spaces maintain relatively constant temperatures, cool in summer, warm in winter, while surface air varies dramatically. This differential drives concision. Warm air rises, cool air falls, and if you provide the right pathways, this natural movement creates circulation. The ventilation shafts of Cappadocian underground cities exploit this principle with remarkable sophistication. Primary shafts, large vertical passages cut from the deepest levels all the way to the surface, served as the main chimneys of the system. Smaller secondary passages branched off to individual chambers and corridors, distributing fresh air throughout the complex. The size and placement of these shafts weren't arbitrary, they were calculated, through trial and error over generations, to ensure adequate airflow for the maximum expected population. In Derinkuyu, archaeologists have documented over 50 ventilation shafts, some extending nearly 80 metres from surface to bottom. The deepest shaft also served as the main water well, its lower sections were reaching into groundwater. This dual-purpose design was elegant. The well provided essential water while the shaft above the waterline provided essential air. Moisture from the water surface even helped humidify the dry underground air, reducing the respiratory irritation that long-term underground living could cause. But ventilation created vulnerabilities that defenders had to address. An open shaft was an invitation for attackers to pour down smoke, burning materials, or even poison. Some raiders, understanding that hidden populations needed air, would systematically search for shaft openings and attempt to smoke refugees out like burrowing animals. The countermeasures were ingenious. Shaft covers, carved from the same stone as the surrounding rock, could seal ventilation openings from below. These covers fit precisely into carved channels, creating nearly airtight seals when closed. With covers in place, the underground complex became a closed system, surviving on whatever air remained within its passages. Communities practiced this emergency sealing, timing how long they could function on stored air before needing to crack the covers for fresh breath. The calculations were grim but necessary. Some ventilation shafts featured intermediate chambers that could trap smoke or contaminants before they reached occupied areas. Others were designed with multiple bends and angles that would diffuse anything poured down from above. A few, this detail borders on the grotesque but illustrates the seriousness of the threat, included channels that could redirect smoke or liquid to drainage areas, essentially flushing out attacks through engineered paths. Historians still argue about ventilation rates in these underground complexes, specifically whether the observed shaft systems could truly support the population numbers sometimes claimed. The mathematics depends on assumptions about per-person air consumption, livestock requirements, and acceptable air quality thresholds. Modern estimates suggest that the larger complexes could indeed support several thousand people for weeks, but probably not the tens of thousands sometimes claimed for maximum capacity. Quality of life would have degraded significantly before oxygen actually ran out. The experience of breathing underground air for extended periods must have left psychological marks. Even with functional ventilation, the air quality in packed refuges would have been poor by modern standards, thick with carbon dioxide, heavy with the smell of bodies and animals, probably carrying various illness-causing pathogens. The headaches and lethargy that come from elevated carbon dioxide levels would have been constant companions. People likely emerged from refuge periods with respiratory irritation and general malaise that took days to fade, and yet they survived. Generation after generation, crisis after crisis, they descended into the stone chambers and breathed the close air and waited and survived. The ventilation systems were good enough, not perfect, not comfortable, but good enough. And good enough was all that survival required. You imagine yourself now in one of those waiting periods, sitting with your back against carved stone, consciously slowing your breathing because everyone has been told that slower breathing means the air lasts longer. It's probably not true in any meaningful sense. The physics don't really work that way, but the instruction gives people something to focus on, a sense of agency in a situation where agency is limited. Breathe slowly, stay calm. The air will last. The shafts are open. The stone above will hold. The first cool draft that reaches you from a distant ventilation shaft feels like a blessing. Someone, some ancestor you never knew, calculated where that shaft should go, how wide to carve it, how to angle it for maximum airflow. They couldn't explain the physics, but they understood the results. And because of that understanding, you're still breathing. The stone exhales. You inhale. The system works. The well shaft drops into darkness beyond the reach of your lamp. And somewhere down there, far down, further than you want to think about, water waits. This shaft isn't just ventilation, though it serves that purpose too. This is the source. This is what makes extended underground survival possible. Without water, the most elaborate refuge becomes a tomb within days. With water, almost anything becomes survivable. Medieval underground builders understood water's centrality with an intensity that modern people, accustomed to turning taps, might struggle to appreciate. Every major underground complex required reliable water access, and the engineering required to provide that access while maintaining security and functionality represented some of the most sophisticated work these communities undertook. The ideal scenario was an underground spring, water that seeped through rock formations and emerged within the refuge itself, requiring no connection to the surface, providing fresh flow that replenished itself naturally. Some complexes were specifically sited to take advantage of such springs. The builders would excavate around the water source, creating cisterns that collected the flow and provided access for residents. These spring-fed refuges were the aristocrats of underground construction, blessed by geology. More commonly, refugees depended on wells that reached down through rock to tap groundwater. The shaft systems we've discussed for ventilation often served this dual purpose, their lower reaches penetrating into water-bearing formations, while their upper reaches circulated air. The well at Derinkuyu descends approximately 55 metres, deep enough to reach reliable groundwater even during dry seasons, deep enough that besiegers couldn't easily poison the supply, deep enough that drawing water required considerable effort. Hauling water from such depths was serious labour. Without pumping mechanisms, medieval communities sometimes had them for surface wells, but underground implementation was rare. Water came up bucket by bucket on ropes. The labour was divided among the community, with shifts assigned to ensure continuous availability. Children old enough to help would take turns at the rope, their small contributions adding up over the duration of refuge periods. Cisterns expanded water storage capacity beyond what wells alone could provide. These carved basins, some holding thousands of gallons, were filled during peacetime and drawn down during emergencies. The constant underground temperature helped prevent spoilage, and the darkness discouraged algae growth. Well-maintained cisterns could provide emergency water supplies, even if wells failed or became contaminated. Historians still argue about water treatment practices in these underground complexes. The evidence is necessarily indirect, residue analysis, comparison with contemporary surface practices, but it seems likely that some filtering and settling occurred. Sand and gravel filters could remove visible particles. Clay vessels were used for storage, and clay naturally absorbed certain contaminants. Whether medieval communities understood these processes scientifically is doubtful, but practical wisdom often precedes theoretical understanding. Water management during extended refuge periods required careful rationing. A community might enter its underground complex with full cisterns and functional wells, confident of adequate supply, only to discover that actual consumption exceeded calculations. More people than expected, livestock drinking more than planned, spillage, waste, the countless small losses that accumulate. The headman or organising council would have to implement restrictions, allocating specific quantities to families, reducing livestock watering, perhaps even making hard decisions about which animals to slaughter early to reduce water demand. The psychological importance of water access extended beyond physical necessity. The sound of water dripping into cisterns, being drawn from wells, moving through channels, provided reassurance in the absolute darkness of underground refuge. Water meant life, meant continuation, meant that the community was functioning as it should. Its sound was a lullaby of survival. Some underground complexes featured elaborate water distribution systems that carried water from central sources to individual chambers. Carved channels in the rock served as primitive pipes, gravity-fed from cisterns positioned at strategic heights. The labour of excavating these channels was immense, but the convenience they provided during the occupation periods justified the investment. A chamber with its own water access required fewer trips through dark corridors, reduced competition at central wells, maintained some degree of household independence even under crowded conditions. Drainage presented the opposite challenge. Water used for cooking, cleaning, and sanitation had to go somewhere, and that somewhere couldn't be allowed to contaminate fresh supplies. Separate drainage channels, carefully positioned lower than water sources, carried wastewater away from occupied areas. Some complexes featured drainage pools where contaminated water could settle before being absorbed into porous rock formations. Others channeled drainage to the surface through passages that emerged far from entrance areas. The interdependence of water and ventilation systems created compound risks. A flood that filled drainage channels could back up into living areas. A collapsed ventilation shaft might also destroy the main well access. A siege that targeted shaft openings affected both air and water simultaneously. Medieval communities thought about these interconnections even if they didn't diagram them. Their survival depended on maintaining multiple systems that all had to function together. You imagine drawing water from one of those deep wells, the rope rough against your palms, the bucket rising from darkness into the dim reach of your lamp. The water itself is cold, clear, tasting of minerals and stone. You drink carefully, aware that others need their share, aware that the supply is finite even if it seems abundant now. Somewhere above, enemies search. Down here, you wait and you drink and you trust the systems that your ancestors built. The well shaft descends into darkness, the water rises, bucket by bucket, life continues. The grain stores are fuller than you've ever seen them, because everyone knew this was coming. The harvest finished weeks ago, and instead of celebrating above ground, the community immediately began transferring supplies below. Basket after basket, descending through the hidden entrance, filling the storage chambers carved specifically for this purpose. You've helped carry enough grain to know that your arms will remember this work for days. But now, sealed underground with enemies searching above, you're grateful for every exhausting trip. Food storage represented perhaps the most critical non-combat aspect of underground refuge survival. Water kept you alive day to day, but extended periods underground, weeks or months during sustained threats, required food reserves calculated and accumulated with serious forethought. Medieval communities developed sophisticated understanding of underground food preservation, exploiting the natural properties of their stone environments to extend the edibility of their supplies. Temperature stability was the primary advantage. Underground chambers maintain relatively constant temperatures year-round, cool in summer, comparatively warm in winter, ranging typically between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius in the Cappadocian complexes. This stability created natural refrigeration, slowing the soilage processes that rapidly degraded food stored in fluctuating surface conditions. Grain stored underground lasted longer. Wine aged better. Preserved meats and cheeses maintained their quality. Grain formed the foundation of stored supplies. Wheat, barley, Millet, the staple crops of the region, could be stored for years in proper conditions, providing the calories needed for survival. Underground granaries featured raised floors that prevented moisture accumulation, carved channels that allowed air circulation, and sealed entrances that excluded vermin. The design principles resembled above-ground granaries, but adapted for the underground environment. Dried legumes supplemented grain stores, adding protein and variety to the refugee diet. Lentils, chickpeas and beans stored well in the cool darkness, requiring only water, available from the well systems, to become edible. The combination of grain and legumes provided reasonably complete nutrition, enough to maintain health during siege periods that might extend for weeks. Preserved meats, salted, smoked or dried, offered concentrated protein and fat, essential for maintaining energy during the stress of underground living. The cool storage conditions helped prevent the rancidity that plagued meat preservation in warmer environments. Cheese, similarly preserved with salt and aging, could last for months in underground chambers. These animal products represented luxury compared to the grain and legume baseline, probably reserved for feeding the young, the old and the ill, rather than distributed equally. Wine occupied a special category. The underground complexes of Cappadocia weren't just refuges, they were often working wineries, with grape presses and fermentation chambers and aging storage carved into the same rock as living quarters. Wine provided calories, lifted morale, served religious functions in Christian communities, and could be used medicinally. The presence of winemaking equipment in these refuges wasn't frivolous. It was practical recognition that survival required more than bare sustenance. Historians still argue about the nutritional adequacy of stored food supplies during extended refuge periods. The diet was certainly limited compared to above-ground living. No fresh vegetables, no fresh fruit, reduced variety overall. Vitamin deficiencies probably developed during longer stays, manifesting as fatigue, skin problems, and reduced immune function. But these deficiencies were survivable, at least for the weeks or months that refuge periods typically lasted. The goal was staying alive until the danger passed, not maintaining optimal health. Cooking facilities in underground refuges were positioned near ventilation shafts for obvious reasons. Smoke from cooking fires needed somewhere to go. Simple hearths carved from stone with channels directing smoke towards shafts allowed preparation of hot food. The ability to cook rather than eat cold preserved rations maintained morale and improved digestibility of grain-based foods. A warm meal in the darkness was a reassurance that normality persisted even as enemies searched above. Food distribution during refuge periods required social organisation that modern disaster planners would recognise. Supplies had to be inventoried, rationed, allocated fairly. Someone had to make decisions about how much each family received, how to handle disputes, what to do when supplies ran lower than expected. The community's existing social structures, village headmen, religious leaders, respected elders, probably handled these functions, but the pressure of underground living must have strained even robust social bonds. One quirky aspect of underground food storage involved pest management. Rats and insects could devastate stored grain if not controlled. Medieval communities used various deterrents: aromatic herbs that insects avoided, cats that hunted rodents, sealed containers that physically excluded pests. The cool temperatures helped, too, slowing insect reproduction and reducing rat activity. But complete exclusion was probably impossible, and some percentage of supplies was lost to vermin, despite best efforts. Children in refuge periods faced particular nutritional challenges. Growing bodies need more than adults relative to size, and the restricted underground diet might not provide adequate support for development. Communities probably prioritised children for whatever fresh food was available. Milk if goats were present, eggs if chickens had been brought down. The investment made survival sense. Children represented the future, and protecting them meant protecting the community's continuation. You reach into one of the grain storage niches now, letting the kernels run through your fingers. Hard, dry, capable of lasting years if kept in these conditions. Each kernel represents labour. Planting, tending, harvesting, carrying below and each kernel represents foresight, the understanding that danger was coming, and preparation could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The stores are full, the community will eat, the danger will pass. The tunnel mouth opens like a wound in the hillside, barely visible beneath a cap of turf and stone. You're standing in what will someday be Ireland, though the name matters less than the landscape. Green hills rolling toward grey sea, mist clinging to valleys, and beneath your feet, passages carved by hands that vanished before anyone thought to write their names. The souterrains of Celtic lands tell a different story than the vast underground cities of Cappadocia, but the impulse beneath them is the same. When danger comes, the earth becomes sanctuary. The word souterrain comes from French souterrains, meaning underground, but the structures themselves predate French influence in these lands by centuries. Irish archaeologists have documented over 1,500 souterrains across the island, with similar structures found throughout Scotland, Cornwall and Brittany. They range from simple passages barely 10 metres long to elaborate complexes with multiple chambers and defensive features. Their exact purpose has puzzled scholars for generations. Unlike the volcanic tuff of Cappadocia, Celtic regions offered no soft stone ideal for carving. The souterrains were built rather than excavated, stone walls carefully fitted together, corbelled roofs assembled from overlapping slabs, the whole structure then buried under earthen mounds. The construction technique resembled that of megalithic tombs from earlier eras, and some scholars have suggested direct continuity. The same communities that built passage graves for their dead adapted the techniques to build hiding places for the living. Dating these structures has proven challenging. Many were in use during the early medieval period, roughly from the 5th to the 11th century CE, when Ireland faced raids from Vikings and internal warfare between competing kingdoms. But archaeological evidence suggests some souterrains originated much earlier, perhaps during the Iron Age, and continued in use, or were reused across centuries. The relationship between construction date and occupation date remains, as historians put it, a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. The defensive features of Irish souterrains suggest concealment as their primary purpose. Entrances were typically hidden, beneath floor slabs of above-ground buildings and corners of earthen banks, disguised by vegetation. Once inside, passages often included creeps, extremely low and narrow sections that forced anyone moving through to crawl, unable to use weapons effectively. These creeps served as choke points, where a defender with a spear could hold off attackers indefinitely. Some souterrains featured what archaeologists call traps, though the term might be misleading. These were concealed pits or drops in passage floors, designed to injure or disorient anyone unfamiliar with the layout. An attacker rushing through a dark passage might suddenly find the floor absent beneath their feet. The psychological impact of such features probably exceeded their physical danger. Once invaders knew a souterrain contained traps, they'd approach with crippling caution. Historians still argue whether souterrains served primarily as refuges for people or as secure storage for valuables. The Irish economy during this period was heavily cattle-based, and cattle raiding was endemic. Entire wars were fought over who owned which cows. Souterrains couldn't accommodate cattle, but they could hide the other wealth that might attract raiders: precious metals, preserved foods, important objects. Perhaps families retreated to souterrains while their cattle were driven off, preserving themselves and their smaller valuables even if livestock was lost. The Scottish equivalent structures, sometimes called earthhouses or weems, show similar characteristics, with regional variations. Aberdeenshire alone has yielded dozens of examples, many discovered accidentally by farmers whose ploughs broke through into underground chambers. The Scottish structures tend to be more elaborate than their Irish counterparts, with curved passages and multiple chambers, but the same principle applies: hidden spaces where people or goods could vanish when danger approached. Cornwall's fogus, the word comes from Cornish fogo meaning cave, represent another regional variation. These structures are typically associated with Iron Age settlements and seem to have served multiple purposes: storage, refuge, possibly ritual use. Their entrances often connect directly to circular houses, suggesting integration into daily life rather than emergency-only use. A fogu might serve as a cool storage space in summer, and an emergency hiding spot if raiders appeared. The dual-purpose question, refuge versus storage, probably presents a false dichotomy. Medieval people didn't think in such categorical terms. A space that held grain during harvest season could hide family members during raiding season. A ritual site could become a refuge when circumstances demanded. The underground structures served whatever purpose their communities needed at any given moment. flexible resources rather than single-function installations. One quirky detail about Celtic souterrains involves their relationship to fairy mythology. Irish folklore is full of stories about the Sidhe, the fairy folk who supposedly live in mounds and underground halls. Some scholars have suggested that souterrains, their entrance is hidden, their interiors mysterious, their purpose is unclear to later generations who had forgotten their original use, contributed to these myths. The small people who disappeared into hills weren't supernatural beings but terrified neighbours, escaping into refuges whose locations were deliberately kept secret. You descend now into one of these passages, your shoulders brushing fitted stone walls, your back bent uncomfortably low. The creep ahead forces you to your hands and knees, the damp earth cold against your palms. Somewhere beyond, a chamber opens up, room enough to sit, perhaps to sleep, certainly to hide. The passage behind you could be blocked, sealed, forgotten until the danger passed. You'd be uncomfortable, cold, terrified, but you'd be alive, and for the builders of these ancient refuges, that was enough. The cliff face catches morning light, and for a moment you can see them. Dark holes in the white stone, rows and clusters of openings that might be natural cavities or might be something else entirely. Then you get closer, and the scale becomes clear. These aren't caves, these are doors, windows. Entire buildings carved into the living rock stacked 5 and 6 levels high, a vertical village clinging to a chalk cliff in the Loire Valley of France. The troglodyte communities of France represent a different approach to underground living than either the deep refuges of Cappadocia or the hidden souterrains of Celtic lands. Here, people didn't hide beneath the earth. They moved into it sideways, carving horizontally into cliff faces rather than digging vertically downward. The result was something between a village and a cave system, structures that offered the protection and stability of underground living while maintaining connection to light and air. The geology made it possible. The Loire Valley sits on limestone and tufa formations soft enough to carve but stable enough to stand. Millennia of river erosion had already created cliff faces riddled with natural cavities, and human inhabitants simply expanded what nature began. A natural hollow became a room became a house, houses connected to become neighbourhoods. By the medieval period, entire communities lived primarily in cliff dwellings, emerging onto the valley floor for farming and trade but retreating into stone for sleep and safety. The advantages for defence were obvious. A village built on flat ground could be approached from any direction. A cliff village had natural protection on at least one side, the cliff itself, and the height provided surveillance advantages. Attackers trying to reach upper-level dwellings had to climb exposed paths while defenders waited above. The narrow passages connecting different levels became natural choke points, defensible by small numbers against larger forces. During the 100 Years' War, that catastrophic conflict between English and French forces that devastated much of France between 1337 and 1453, the troglodyte villages became critical refuges. Armies swept through the Loire Valley repeatedly, burning surface buildings and seizing supplies, but the cliff dwellings were difficult to burn and harder to storm. Communities that might have been destroyed entirely survived by retreating into stone, waiting out passages of armies, emerging to rebuild what had been destroyed above ground. Historians still argue about population numbers in these cliff communities. Some estimates suggest that certain troglodyte villages housed thousands of residents during peak periods, with every available cliff face riddled with chambers. Other scholars argue for smaller numbers, noting that the cave dwellings were probably supplemented by surface structures that didn't survive. The truth may vary by period and location, some villages growing large during dangerous times, contracting when peace made surface living attractive again. The living conditions were mixed. On the positive side, the cliff dwellings maintained stable temperatures year-round, cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. The stone walls provided excellent insulation. Moisture control was better than in many surface structures, the porous stone absorbing and releasing humidity to maintain comfortable levels. People reported sleeping better in cave dwellings, probably due to the consistent temperatures and the muffling of outdoor sounds. On the negative side, the cliff dwellings were dark. Even chambers near cliff faces received limited natural light, and interior rooms were essentially caves. Candles and oil lamps provided illumination, but the expense of maintaining adequate lighting pushed many families towards schedules so that maximised daylight activities. The smoke from fires necessary for the cooking and heating, required careful management, with chimney channels carved through the rock to vent above the cliffline. One quirky aspect of Loire Valley troglodyte life involved wine production. The constant cool temperatures of cave chambers proved ideal for wine aging, and many cliff dwellings incorporated wine cellars of an impressive scale. Some families lived in relatively modest chambers, but maintained wine storage that extended deep into the cliff, the bottles resting in carved niches that hadn't changed temperature in centuries. The region's wine reputation was built, partly on geology, not just the soil that grew the grapes, but the stone that stored the wine. The architecture of cliff dwellings evolved over centuries of occupation. Early chambers were simple hollows, barely modified from natural cavities. Later construction featured squared rooms, carved columns, decorative elements that made the spaces feel less like caves and more like proper buildings. Some elaborate dwellings included carved furniture, benches, shelves, even beds shaped from the living rock, impossible to remove but never needing replacement. Religious spaces occupied special positions in many troglodyte communities. Chapels carved into cliff faces featured carved altars, niches for saints, even small bell towers accessible through rock-cut stairs. The acoustics of these cave churches were remarkable, sound reverberating from stone surfaces, creating an atmosphere that felt both intimate and eternal. Services held in these spaces probably carried particular intensity. Worship conducted in chambers that might have sheltered Christians for 1,000 years. You stand in one of these cave doorways now, looking out over the valley. Behind you, the chamber extends into darkness, rooms beyond rooms, some not opened in decades, some probably unexplored by anyone living. Below, the river moves as it has moved for millennia. Above, the cliff rises, riddled with more openings, more lives, more history than any chronicle recorded. The stone holds its people, the valley remembers. The pub stands on a perfectly ordinary street in a perfectly modern city, and nothing about its appearance suggests anything unusual. You push through the door, order a drink, settle into a corner booth. The evening crowd is sparse, mostly locals unwinding after work. Then someone mentions, almost casually, that there's a medieval tannery directly beneath your feet. You realise you're sitting above history. Nottingham's underground network represents a peculiar variant of medieval-y subterranean construction, not defensive refuges exactly, not cliff dieta, not cliff dwellings, but a working industrial and commercial infrastructure carved from sandstone beneath a functioning city. The caves served purposes that range from the practical to the peculiar, and many remain accessible today, hidden beneath shops and homes and pubs that show no surface indication of what lies below. The Nottingham sandstone, locally called Bunter sandstone, proved remarkably cooperative for excavation. Soft enough to carve with hand tools, stable enough to stand without extensive reinforcement, naturally dry due to its porous structure. Medieval inhabitants recognised these properties and exploited them systematically. What began as cellars beneath the individual buildings expanded over centuries into an interconnected network that some estimates suggest includes over 800 caves beneath the modern city. The earliest documented caves date to around the 9th or 10th century, when Nottingham was a Saxon settlement of growing importance. Anglo-Saxon laws actually mentioned the caves, restricting who could dig them, and requiring permission from relevant authorities. This early regulation suggests that underground construction had already become common enough to require management, a problem you don't address unless the activity is widespread. Tanneries were among the most common underground installations, and for good reason. Tanning hides was a spectacularly unpleasant process that produced odours capable of clearing neighbourhoods. By conducting tanning underground, craftsmen contained the worst smells while taking advantage of the constant temperatures and humidity that leather processing required. The caves beneath modern Nottingham still show evidence of tanning operations, carved basins, drainage channels, the distinctive wear patterns of heavy industrial use. But tanning was just the beginning. Medieval Nottingham's caves served as breweries, exploiting the cool stable, temperatures ideal for fermentation. They served as storage for merchants who needed secure space for valuable goods. They served as living quarters for the desperately poor who couldn't afford surface housing. They served as religious spaces, secular meeting places, and, according to local legend, hideouts for outlaws, though the Robin Hood associations are probably more tourist marketing than historical fact. Historians still argue about the extent of intentional interconnection between Nottingham's caves. Some chambers were clearly designed as independent spaces, accessible only from specific surface buildings. Others seem to have been deliberately linked, creating passages that allowed movement beneath the city invisible to surface observers. Whether these connections served legitimate purposes, emergency escape, discreet commercial activity, or facilitated smuggling, crime, and other irregular behaviour remains unclear. The defensive potential of Nottingham's caves became relevant during the English Civil War, when the city served as a royalist stronghold. King Charles I raised his standard here in 1642, beginning the conflict that would eventually cost him his crown and his head. The caves provided storage for weapons and supplies, shelter during bombardment, and potential escape routes if the surface defences failed. The underground infrastructure that had developed for commercial purposes proved militarily valuable when circumstances demanded. One quirky feature of Nottingham's cave system involves the Victorian tendency toward elaborate cave construction. By the 19th century, the caves had largely lost their practical purposes. Tanning had moved elsewhere. Modern brewing didn't require cave conditions. Storage needs were met by warehouses. But wealthy Victorians developed a fashion for cave gardens, cave ballrooms, even cave swimming pools beneath their homes. These elaborate underground spaces borrowed the medieval tradition of cave construction while serving purely recreational purposes. The caves also served darker purposes at various points. During outbreaks of plague, infected individuals were sometimes isolated in underground chambers away from the healthy population, quarantined by burial. Debtors hiding from creditors found refuge in caves beneath sympathetic homes. Criminals conducted their business in underground spaces where authorities couldn't easily reach. The caves represented a parallel city, a shadow Nottingham, operating beneath the respectable surface settlement. Modern archaeology has only begun to document Nottingham's underground extent. Property owners occasionally discover previously unknown caves beneath their buildings, opening into chambers that might not have been entered in centuries. The city has launched systematic surveys, but the complexity of the network and the difficulty of accessing many caves means that comprehensive documentation remains incomplete. There are almost certainly chambers beneath Nottingham that no living person has seen. You finish your drink and consider the floor beneath your booth. Somewhere down there, medieval tanners scraped hides and cursed the smell. Brewers checked their fermentation and worried about their competition. Merchants counted their inventories and calculated their profits. Poor families slept on stone beds and dreamed of better circumstances. The sandstone held them all, and holds their memory still. The city walks above, the caves wait below, the two cities coexist, one in light and one in darkness, each necessary to the other. The goat doesn't want to go underground, and you can hardly blame it. The passage is narrow, the slope is steep, and the darkness ahead smells wrong. Too many humans, too many animals already below, too much confinement for a creature built for mountainsides and open air. But the goat doesn't get a vote. You grip the rope tighter, brace yourself against the stone wall and pull. Behind you, your sister is doing the same with another goat. Behind her, your mother carries a chicken under each arm. The whole household is descending, creatures and cargo and people, into the earth's embrace. Living with livestock underground seems almost absurdly impractical, until you understand the economics of medieval rural life. A family's wealth was measured in animals. Cattle, goats, sheep. These weren't just food sources, but capital accumulated over years, essential for survival. When raiders came, they came specifically for this wealth. Hiding yourself while leaving your animals above meant preserving your life but destroying your livelihood. The only solution was to bring everything below. The underground cities of Cappadocia were designed with livestock in mind from the beginning. The first level, the shallowest, most easily accessed, typically served as animal quarters. Ceilings rose higher than in human habitations, accommodating the stature of cattle and horses. Passages were wider, allowing animals to be led rather than carried. Feeding troughs carved from stone lined the walls. The infrastructure for animal management was as carefully planned as any defensive feature. The smell was, by all reasonable estimates, remarkable. Pack several hundred animals into enclosed stone chambers, add several hundred humans, eliminate the natural ventilation of outdoor living, and the result would challenge modern sensibilities to the breaking point. Medieval noses were presumably more tolerant. People lived closer to their animals in general. Sanitation standards differed dramatically. But even so, the olfactory experience of underground refuge must have been intense. waste management became critical. Animal waste accumulates rapidly. A single cow produces about 60 pounds of manure daily, and without removal systems, underground spaces would become uninhabitable within days. Communities designated waste areas, carved drainage channels, and assigned labour details to management duties. The work was unpleasant but essential. Some complexes featured dedicated waste chambers that could be sealed off when full, containing the problem physically while long-term solutions were arranged. Historians still argue about feed supplies for underground livestock. Animals don't eat stone, and unlike humans, they can't subsist on dried grain alone. Cattle need forage, goats need browse. How did communities maintain livestock underground for extended periods? The answer probably involved calculated sacrifice. Animals were brought below with whatever feed could be stockpiled, and when feed ran out, animals were slaughtered, providing meat for human consumption while eliminating mouths that could no longer be fed. The transition was brutal but logical. Smaller animals presented different challenges. Chickens, if present, could be maintained in small spaces and fed grain scraps, providing eggs that supplemented protein supplies. Goats, adaptable and compact, handled underground conditions better than cattle. Pigs, omnivorous and tolerant, could eat almost anything and thrived in cave conditions. The traditional association between caves and pig raising probably has roots in this adaptability. The sounds of underground livestock added another dimension to refuge life. The lowing of cattle, the bleating of goats, the clucking of chickens, all echoing through stone passages amplified and distorted by acoustics. Children who grew up hearing farm sounds in open fields heard those same sounds transformed underground into something stranger, more enclosed, more desperate. The familiar made unfamiliar by context. One quirky benefit of livestock presence involved heat. Large animals produce considerable body heat, and in enclosed spaces, this heat accumulated. A chamber crowded with cattle might be uncomfortable in summer, but welcome in winter, the animals serving as living furnaces. Some evidence suggests that living quarters were intentionally positioned near animal areas to take advantage of this heat transfer, stone walls absorbing warmth from the stable side and radiating it into human chambers. The emotional dimension of bringing animals underground deserves consideration too. These weren't abstract units of wealth, they were individuals known by name, raised from birth. A child might have helped a particular cow calve, fed a particular goat since it was a kid. Bringing these animals into the frightening darkness, watching them panic and calm, tending them in impossible conditions, this created bonds that went beyond economics. The family saved its animals because the animals were family. The end of refuge periods brought its own animal-related challenges. Livestock kept underground for extended periods weakened. Muscles atrophied from the restricted movement. Respiratory problems developed from poor air quality. Stress reduced milk production and affected breeding. Animals that had been strong and productive, going down might emerge diminished. The recovery period, as livestock readjusted to surface conditions, extended the disruption far beyond the danger period itself. You emerge now into daylight, blinking, the goat pulling eagerly toward grass it can finally see. The creature practically drags you toward the nearest green patch, desperate for something other than stored feed and stone walls. You let it go, watching it graze with an intensity that suggests it understands exactly how close it came to never grazing again. The animal survived. You survived. Underground, the waste chambers wait to be emptied, the feeding troughs to be cleaned, the spaces to be prepared for next time. Because there's always a next time. That's why the refugees exist. That's why you bring the animals. The children are restless again, and you can hardly blame them. They've been underground for 4 days now, confined to chambers barely large enough for sleeping, forbidden to run or shout or do any of the things children need to do. The youngest ones don't understand why they can't go outside. The older ones understand all too well, and their understanding makes them more anxious, not less. Someone needs to keep them occupied before the whimpering becomes sobbing, becomes wailing, becomes a sound that might penetrate to the surface. Children in underground refuges face challenges that adults, focused on survival logistics, sometimes underestimated. The young body needs movement. The young mind needs stimulation. The young heart needs reassurance. Underground refuge provided none of these naturally, only darkness, confinement, and the palpable fear of adults trying to seem calm. Managing children during extended refuge periods required creativity, patience, and a willingness to bend normal rules about behaviour and discipline. education continued in some underground complexes, particularly in the Byzantine Christian communities of Cappadocia. The carved chambers, identified as missionary schools, weren't used only during peacetime. Children still needed to learn, still needed routine, still needed something to focus their attention besides the oppressive reality of their situation. Teachers gathered students in designated chambers, lit precious oil lamps, and conducted lessons in reading, religious instruction, and other skills. The quality of education probably suffered, but the structure mattered more than the content. Games evolved to fit underground constraints. Running games were impossible, but quiet games, word games, memory games, finger games, could occupy children without producing dangerous noise. Stories told in whispers kept young minds engaged while building narrative skills they'd use throughout their lives. Riddles passed the time and exercised thinking. Children taught each other the games their grandparents had taught them, traditions passing through generations in darkness. Historians still argue about the psychological impact on the children of repeated underground refuge experiences. Some suggest that growing up with this cycle, danger, descent, confinement, emergence, produced resilient personalities, individuals who understood that bad times pass and that community cooperation ensures survival. Others propose lasting trauma effects, anxiety disorders and claustrophobia that shaped adult personalities. The truth probably varied by individual, by family circumstances, by specific experiences during refugee periods. The youngest children, infants and toddlers, presented particular difficulties. Babies cry, crying makes noise, noise carries. During the most dangerous periods when discovery meant death for everyone, infant crying posed existential threats to entire communities. How parents handled this is not extensively documented, and modern people might prefer not to speculate too specifically. Sedation with alcohol or herbal preparations was probably common. Physical muffling, unfortunately, was probably also used. One quirky adaptation involved children as workers in the underground economy of survival. Young hands could fit into narrow spaces adults couldn't reach. Children could be assigned tasks appropriate to their age and ability, carrying water, distributing food, helping with younger siblings. This labour served practical purposes, but its psychological value might have been even greater. Children who felt useful, who contributed to community survival, probably coped better than those who felt merely confined. The sensory deprivation of underground life affected children differently than adults. Darkness that adults tolerated, knowing it was temporary, frightened children who didn't understand temporal horizons. The close air that adults breathed without comment alarmed children accustomed to wind and sky. Small children asked when they could go outside, asked repeatedly, asked until adults had no more answers. The questions eventually stopped, but the longing probably didn't. Play spaces were carved into some underground complexes, areas where children could move more freely without disturbing others or endangering security. These spaces were positioned away from entrances and ventilation shafts, where noise would least likely carry to the surface. Some show evidence of carved toys, stone balls, animal figures, simple game boards scratched into floors. Medieval children played with toys, and underground children needed toys more than most. The transition out of underground refuge presented its own challenges for children. The sudden light after days of darkness was physically painful. The open spaces felt overwhelming after cramped chambers. Children who had spent formative days underground sometimes showed reluctance to return to surface activities, as if the dark places had become safer than the bright ones. Parents coaxed and encouraged and eventually succeeded, but the process took time. You watch the children now, gathered in a circle around an older woman who tells stories in a voice barely above a whisper. Her hands move through lamplight, casting shadows on stone walls. Shadow puppets, maybe, or just the natural gestures of a practiced storyteller. The children's faces follow her movements, their fear temporarily forgotten, their restlessness channeled into imagination. The story involves a hero, probably, and a monster, certainly, and a victory that feels impossible until suddenly it's not. The story ends. The children clap softly, knowing instinctively that loud applause is forbidden. The woman begins another tale, her voice steady, her hands continuing their shadow dance. Outside the chamber, adults handle the serious work of survival. In here, in this small carved space, Children learn that stories can carry you through darkness. The lamp flickers, the shadows dance, the children listen. The carved cross catches lamplight, its simple lines throwing shadows across the stone altar beneath. You're standing in a church, though you'd never know it from outside. No steeple, no windows, no bells to call the faithful. This church is underground, carved from the same rock as the living quarters and storage chambers, and the service about to begin will be conducted in whispers. Prayer finds a way, even here. Perhaps especially here. Religious practice in underground refuges served purposes that went beyond spiritual sustenance, though that alone would have justified the effort. Church services provided schedule and routine in environments that lack natural time markers. They brought communities together in shared ritual, when confinement might otherwise fragment them into isolated family units. They offered hope when circumstances seemed hopeless, the promise of divine protection more valuable than any rolling stone door. The Byzantine Christians of Cappadocia were particularly devoted underground church builders. The region's caves contain hundreds of carved chapels, many decorated with frescoes that survive remarkably, well, thanks to the stable underground climate. Some of these churches were used year-round, not just during refuge periods. The cool, consistent environment proved ideal for contemplation and worship. But during times of danger, when surface churches became targets, the underground spaces became essential. The architecture of underground churches imitated surface structures as closely as carved stone permitted. Aisles and naves were cut from living rock. Columns were carved rather than constructed, left standing when surrounding material was removed. Altars occupied traditional positions, even though orientation toward Jerusalem required creative adaptation in chambers that might face any direction. The builders wanted their underground churches to feel like proper churches, not improvised spaces, because they were proper churches, consecrated and sanctified despite their unusual construction. Historians still argue about the specific liturgical practices conducted in these underground spaces. Orthodox Christian worship involves considerable standing, movement and vocalization, not obviously compatible with hiding from enemies above. Some scholars suggest that abbreviated services were developed for refuge use, maintaining essential elements while reducing noise. Others propose that full services were conducted during quieter periods, perhaps late at night, when detection risk was minimal. The church maintained its requirements, the faithful found ways to meet them. One quirky detail involves acoustic modification in some underground churches. The natural reverberance of stone chambers could be adjusted by carved surfaces and positioned hangings, creating acoustic environments that amplified certain frequencies while dampening others. A whispered prayer might resonate perfectly for congregants while remaining inaudible at distance. Whether this acoustic engineering was intentional or discovered by accident, its effects made underground worship more feasible. Icons occupied special importance in Orthodox worship. Their presence in underground churches created preservation opportunities. Painted icons above ground weathered and faded, damaged by light and humidity and the simple passage of time. Underground icons, protected from these forces, sometimes survived in remarkable condition. Some of the best preserved Byzantine religious art exists in Cappadocian cave churches, not because it was specially protected, but simply because underground conditions are better for paint longevity. The integration of religious and defensive functions sometimes produced unexpected features. Some church entrances were protected by rolling stone doors, suggesting that religious spaces also served as inner refuges, the last retreat if outer defences failed. Holy ground as final sanctuary wasn't just metaphor, it was architecture. The sacred and the survival practical merged in stone. Baptisms and funerals still had to occur during refuge periods, and the underground churches accommodated these essential rites. Carved baptismal fonts held blessed water. Burial sometimes happened within the complex itself, though more often the dead were held until surface conditions permitted proper interment. The cycle of life continued underground, marked by religious ceremonies that maintained continuity with surface practice. Community conflict found release in religious settings too. Weeks of confinement produced tensions that could tear communities apart, disputes over food allocation, space use, noise, the countless frictions of overcrowded living. The church provided neutral ground, a place where community bonds could be reinforced, where grievances could be addressed in structured ritual context. where the authority of shared faith could smooth conflicts that secular leadership couldn't resolve. You kneel now on stone worn smooth by generations of knees, in a chamber where lamplight has flickered for 1,000 years. The priest, or the person serving as priest, who knows if proper ordination matters here, intones familiar words in a voice barely above breath. Around you, others kneel, their faces orange in the lamplight, their eyes closed, their lips moving in silent responses they learned as children. The words are old, the chamber is old, the need for hope is eternal, the service ends. People rise, return to their chambers, their storage duties, their children, their animals. Something has shifted though, some weight lifted, some burden shared, some faith renewed. The danger hasn't passed, the surface isn't safe, but something about the ritual, the community, the carved cross in the lamplight has reminded them why they're surviving. God knows what happens underground, and underground that knowledge matters. The oil runs down the channel, thick and dark, pooling in the carved basin beside the passage entrance. You've helped pour it, everyone helped, bucket after bucket hauled from storage, chambers where it had been kept for exactly this purpose. The oil isn't for cooking, the oil isn't for lamps, the oil is for the enemies working their way toward you through the outer passages, and when they reach this point, when they trigger the mechanism, the oil will become fire. Defence systems in the underground refuges ranged from simple to sophisticated, but they all shared a common principle: make the cost of invasion so high that invaders would choose to leave. Rolling stone doors were the primary defence, but they were hardly the only one. Communities that expected serious assault developed layered defensive systems designed to delay, injure, demoralize, and ultimately repel attackers determined to breach their refuges. Oil channels appeared in multiple Cappadocian underground cities, carved into floors and walls of passages likely to be contested. The oil, olive oil probably, stored in quantities that represented significant economic investment, could be ignited to create walls of fire in enclosed spaces. Attackers facing such defences confronted a terrible choice: advance through fire and risk horrifying burns, or retreat and find another route that might be equally defended. Smoke represented another weapon, one that didn't require precious oil. Defenders could light fires at their own positions and direct smoke toward enemy-controlled areas using the ventilation system they knew intimately. Invaders unfamiliar with the complex's layout would choke and stumble in passages already disorienting, while defenders retreated through clean air passages to prepared positions. The manipulation of airflow turned the entire underground network into a respiratory weapon. Historians still argue about the frequency of actual combat in underground refuges. Physical evidence is limited, battles don't leave the same archaeological traces as construction, and written accounts focus on successful defences rather than defeats. Some scholars suggest that most refuge MDR, periods passed without direct assault, invaders choosing to bypass defended positions rather than accept casualties. Others point to evidence of violence, disturbed human remains, fire damage, deliberate destruction, suggesting that some refugees were successfully breached. The narrow creeps mentioned earlier in our discussion of Celtic souterrains appeared in Cappadocian contexts too, though usually called choke points or defensive passages. These sections, barely wide enough for one person to pass, transformed numerical advantage into liability. An army of 1,000 meant nothing if only one man at a time could advance, and that one man faced a defender with every advantage. Knowledge of terrain, time to prepare, desperation that multiplied strength. Collapsible passages offered another defensive option, though one used only in extremity. Certain sections could be deliberately collapsed, sealing routes that enemies had successfully penetrated. The technique required pre-positioning, weakened supports, carved channels for collapse propagation, and acceptance that the collapsed section would require significant labour to restore. But if enemies had breached outer defences and threatened the community's core, destroying passages behind you could buy time to escape through alternatives or simply ensure that invaders couldn't reach the final refuge. Trap features appeared in some complexes, though their nature remains debated. Concealed pits, false floors, passages that led to dead ends or worse, these features appear in local legends and some physical evidence. But distinguishing actual traps from construction accidents or later deterioration proves difficult. The psychological value of trap reputation probably exceeded actual trap deployment. Invaders who believed they might fall into pits at any moment moved slowly and cautiously, buying time for defenders. One quirky defensive feature involved sonic weapons of a sort. The acoustic properties of underground passages could be exploited to project sounds in disorienting directions. Defenders shouting or banging metal in one location might sound like they were in several locations, or in no particular location at all. Enemies already struggling with darkness and unfamiliar terrain faced audio confusion that further degraded their combat effectiveness. The human element of underground defense deserves emphasis. All the engineering in the world meant nothing without people willing to implement it, to pour the oil and light the fire, to stand in narrow passages and face attackers who might break through. Communities designated defenders, probably the most capable fighters, and those individuals understood that their role was to buy time for others to retreat deeper, to seal doors, to escape if escape routes remained. The defensive positions were often designed as potential last stands. You stand in a defensive position now, a narrow passage with a rolling stone ready at your back. Your hands shake, anyone's wood, and the sounds from the outer passages suggest that the invaders are still searching, still probing, still looking for the way through. The oil waits in its channel. The torch waits in your hand. Everything depends on whether they find this passage, and if they do, everything depends on you. The waiting is the hardest part. The defense, when it comes, will be almost a relief. The messenger arrived at midnight, slipping through passages your village hasn't used in months, emerging in a chamber where the elders were already gathering because they'd seen the signal 3 hours earlier. A specific pattern of smoke from the watchtower, visible from your hilltop but invisible to the forces approaching from the south. Before the messenger spoke a word, preparations had already begun. The underground communities of the medieval world didn't survive by luck. They survived by communication. Networks of signals, passages, and protocols connected communities across regions that modern observers might assume were isolated. The underground refugees weren't islands, they were nodes in systems designed to share information, coordinate responses, and provide mutual support when individual villages faced threats too large to handle alone. This coordination required planning, trust, and infrastructure that developed over generations. The most visible communication method was fire signaling. Watchposts positioned on high ground could see other watchposts miles away, and specific fire patterns, number of flames, duration, colour, modified by added materials, conveyed coded information. Enemy approaching from the east. Raiders estimated 200. Movement toward the valley. Villages that received these signals passed them along, each community alerting the next, creating a relay system that could spread information faster than any mounted messenger. Underground tunnel connections between villages, mentioned earlier in our discussion of Durin Kuyu, served multiple communication functions. Messengers could travel beneath the surface, invisible to observers above, carrying detailed information that signal fires couldn't convey. During active refugee periods, these tunnels allowed coordinated defense, reinforcements moving between refuges, supplies redistributed, intelligence shared about enemy movements observed from different positions. Historians still argue about the extent and organization of these communication networks. Some scholars propose formal structures, something like early warning systems managed by regional authorities. Others suggest more organic arrangements, neighbouring villages cooperating because cooperation served mutual interest, without external organisation. The physical evidence, signal tower foundations, connecting tunnels, standardised signal protocols mentioned in later accounts, suggest significant coordination, but the administrative structures that maintained it remain unclear. One quirky feature of medieval communication involved acoustic signals through underground passages. Sound travels well through stone, and patterns of knocks or horn blasts could convey information through tunnel networks. A specific rhythm might mean all clear, another might mean prepare for evacuation. Communities developed codes that outsiders couldn't interpret, essentially underground telegraph systems predating electricity by centuries. The social infrastructure of communication networks required trust that transcended village boundaries. A false signal, whether by accident or treachery, could cause unnecessary panic. Wasteful evacuations, or worse, could demask a genuine threat until too late. Communities that participated in signalling networks held each other accountable, and the consequences for false signals were severe. Reputation mattered enormously. A village known for reliable signals was valued, while one known for errors might find itself excluded from networks it achieved all desperately needed. Refugees from one community could seek shelter in another's underground refuge, and protocols existed for handling such situations. Space allocation, resource sharing, authority structures, these matters needed resolution before emergencies, not during them. Written agreements probably didn't exist for most such arrangements, but oral understandings, probably reinforced by religious oaths, bound communities to mutual aid. When the underground city at Cappadocia reached capacity, overflow could be directed to Derinkuyu through the connecting tunnel, a system that only worked because both communities had agreed to it in advance. Communication also flowed vertically through time. Accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation. Elders who remembered past crises taught younger community members what had worked and what hadn't. Signal codes, evacuation procedures, defensive tactics. All this information transferred through practice and instruction. The underground refugees were physical infrastructure, but the knowledge to use them effectively was infrastructure too, as carefully maintained as any stone passage. The messenger in your imagined scenario carries specific intelligence. The approaching force is large, larger than your village can handle alone, but the force is moving slowly, giving time for the regional network to respond. Other villages have been alerted. Reinforcements will arrive at dawn. Your role is to delay, to make the attackers work for every foot of progress, to buy time for the coordination to complete. You acknowledge the message, offer the messenger food and rest, send runners to ensure your own preparations are complete. The system is working, the network is functioning. You're not alone. You haven't been alone since your great-great-grandmother helped establish the signal protocol still in use today. Community extends beyond your village walls, beneath the ground, across the region, through time itself. The signal fires burn, the passages carry messages, the network holds. She organises the grain rations with the same precise attention she gives to everything, measuring, recording, ensuring that each family receives its allocation, that the stores will last as long as necessary, that no one takes more than their share. The children call her grandmother, though the relationship is more complicated than that. She's the one who keeps the refuge functioning, who knows where everything is stored and how long it will last, who mediates disputes before they become crises. Without her, and women like her, underground survival would collapse within days. Women's roles in underground refuge communities encompassed far more than modern observers sometimes assume. Medieval societies were patriarchal in their formal structures, but survival situations don't care about formal structures. Underground refugees required organisational skills, social management, resource allocation, childcare, coordination, and medical care, work that fell primarily to women and without which all the engineering achievements would have meant nothing. Food management was perhaps the most critical daily function, and it was overwhelmingly women's work. Knowing what supplies existed, where they were stored, how to prepare them with limited fuel and uncertain water, how to stretch resources when initial calculations proved optimistic, all this required expertise that women developed through generations of household management. The transfer from surface household to underground refuge demanded adaptation, but the core competencies remained. Make what you have last as long as it needs to last. Historians still argue about formal authority structures in underground communities. Male heads of household probably retained nominal leadership, and male figures probably made military decisions about defence. But the day-to-day functioning of refuge life operated through networks of female authority that formal accounts rarely acknowledge. The grandmother distributing grain held power regardless of what anyone called it. Childcare during refuge periods required coordination beyond individual family capacity. Mothers who were ill, or who had other essential duties, needed their children tended by others. Women organised collective childcare systems, grouping children by age, assigning supervisors, creating rotations that shared burdens fairly. The practical feminism of survival didn't require ideological justification, it simply worked better than alternatives. Medical care, such as it was, fell largely to women as well. Herbal knowledge, nursing skills, the ability to assess illness and injury, these capabilities transferred from surface to underground practice. The cool, stable underground environment actually improved some medical conditions while exacerbating others. Women learned what worked in the new context, adapting surface knowledge to underground realities. One quirky, aspect of women's underground work involved textile production. Spinning and weaving could continue by lamplight in confined spaces, and the work helped pass time during long refuge periods. The steady rhythm of spinning provided meditation of a sort, calming nervous hands and focusing anxious minds. Cloth produced underground was probably lower quality than surface work. Light limitations affected everything, but the activity mattered as much as the product. Conflict resolution drew heavily on female social networks. Weeks of confinement produced tensions that could explode into violence, destroying the social cohesion essential for survival. Women mediated these conflicts through informal channels, conversations, adjustments to living arrangements, redistribution of resources that addressed underlying grievances. The emotional labour of maintaining community harmony was real work, as essential as digging passages or storing grain. Women also maintained the religious practices that structured community life. In Orthodox Christian communities, specific prayers and observances fell to women, and these continued underground. The rhythm of religious practice, daily prayers, weekly observances, seasonal celebrations adjusted for underground circumstances, provided temporal structure in environments that lacked natural day-night cycles. Women ensured that important dates weren't forgotten, that traditions continued, that children learned what children needed to learn. The specific identities of these women are largely lost to history. Chronicles that mentioned underground refugees focused on construction, defence, military events, the work of men. The organisational expertise, the social management, the countless essential tasks performed by women went unrecorded because the recorders didn't consider them noteworthy. We know that underground refugees functioned for extended periods. We know that this functioning required immense coordination. We must infer who performed that coordination because no one thought to write it down. You watch the grandmother now as she completes her distribution, exchanging words with each family, noting requests, adjusting where needed. Her movements are efficient but unhurried. Panic would spread if she seemed panicked. Behind her eyes, calculations continue. Supplies remaining, days expected, consumption rates, contingencies. She doesn't call this mathematics. She calls it common sense. But it's keeping everyone alive. The grain distributed, she moves to her next task. The refuge continues. The work never ends. The fever started 3 days ago, and now the sick chamber holds more people than anyone wants to acknowledge. You can hear coughing echoing through the passages, a sound that silences conversations and darkens faces. Underground refuge protects against human enemies, but against invisible enemies. Disease, infection, the simple multiplication of suffering in crowded conditions. The stone walls offer no defence at all. Disease and death were inevitable companions of underground living, particularly during extended refuge periods. The combination of crowding, limited sanitation, psychological stress, and nutritional restrictions created conditions where illness spread rapidly and mortality rates climbed. Communities that survived military threats sometimes lost more members to disease than they would have lost to combat. The germ theory of disease lay centuries in the future, but medieval communities understood contagion in practical terms. They observed that illness spread from person to person, that proximity increased risk, that certain conditions made sickness more likely. Underground refuges implemented isolation practices based on these observations, separate chambers for the sick, designated caregivers who minimized contact with the healthy, protocols for handling the dead. Respiratory infections spread fastest in the close air of underground passages. The limited ventilation that barely sufficed for healthy populations became entirely inadequate when illness increased, coughing and breathing difficulties. Communities faced terrible calculations. Improve ventilation by opening shafts that might reveal their position, or maintain concealment while disease reduced their numbers. There were no good options, only less bad ones. Historians still argue about mortality rates during underground refuge periods. The data simply don't exist for most communities. Deaths weren't recorded with precision, and deaths underground weren't distinguished from deaths generally. Archaeological evidence, human remains found in underground contexts, suggests that some deaths occurred during refuge periods, but determining causes of death centuries later challenges forensic capabilities. Burial practices during refuge periods pose particular difficulties. In normal circumstances, the dead would be buried in consecrated ground with appropriate religious ceremonies. Underground, during active threats, full burial wasn't possible. Bodies might be held in isolated chambers or wrapped and stored until surface conditions permitted proper interment. The psychological burden of living alongside the dead, even temporarily, added to the stress of underground existence. One quirky adaptation involved the use of aromatic herbs and incense to mask the smell of illness and death. Medieval people couldn't prevent disease spread, but they could make sick chambers slightly more bearable for caregivers and slightly less terrifying for patients. The herbs may even have had mild antiseptic properties, though this wasn't the reason they were used. Mental health deteriorated alongside physical health. Extended darkness, confinement, fear, grief. These stresses accumulated without release. Some individuals experienced what we would now recognise as depression, anxiety, panic disorders. Medieval terminology differed, but the experiences were real. Communities developed responses, keeping people occupied, maintaining social structures, religious practice, storytelling, all the techniques discussed earlier, served mental health as much as any other function. The caregivers themselves faced elevated risks. Those who tended the sick were more likely to become sick, creating cycles of depletion that could eliminate a community's most capable members. Some communities rotated caregiving duties to spread risk. Others designated specific individuals whose health would be sacrificed to protect others. The ethical dimensions of these decisions weren't discussed in modern bioethical terms, but the underlying calculations were the same. Children and elderly community members proved most vulnerable to both disease and the psychological strains of underground living. The young lacked developed immune systems, the old lacked reserves to fight illness. These vulnerable populations required extra protection and extra resources, straining supplies that were never truly adequate. Decisions about who received priority for limited food and medical attention weren't abstract. They involved specific people, known and loved. When refuge periods ended, survivors emerged into daylight, carrying burdens that didn't appear in any inventory. Loss, trauma. The memories of those who hadn't emerged. Communities that had entered underground as neighbours, and families emerged as survivors, bound by shared suffering in ways that changed all subsequent relationships. You visit the sick chamber now, bringing water that the fevered desperately need. The air is thick, the sounds distressing. The faces of the ill a reminder of mortality that underground existence can't escape. You offer what comfort you can. You retreat when your duties end. And you hope, without confidence, that the fever won't spread further, that the losses will stop, that enough of your community will survive to rebuild whatever waits above. The stone protects against some threats. Against others, the stone is merely a witness. The first generation to emerge called themselves visitors to the surface. They would complete necessary tasks, planting, trading, checking on above-ground structures, then return to their underground homes as night fell. Their children continued this pattern, the underground becoming not emergency refuge but ordinary dwelling, the surface a place of work and danger rather than home. By the third generation, the distinction between refuge and residence had essentially vanished. Some communities never fully returned to surface living after extended danger periods ended. The underground complexes that had sheltered them temporarily became permanent homes, modified and expanded for comfort rather than mere survival. What began as emergency architecture evolved into lifestyle choice, the troglodyte existence continuing long after the raiders who originally drove people underground had vanished from history. The logic made practical sense in many situations. Underground dwellings required no heating fuel in winter. The stable temperatures were comfortable year-round. They needed no cooling in summer. The same stability worked in reverse. They resisted fire, flood, and windstorm. They provided security against the opportunistic violence that never entirely disappeared from medieval life. If you'd invested generations of labour creating underground spaces, why not use them even when danger wasn't imminent? The transition from refuge to residence changed construction priorities. Emergency shelters could sacrifice comfort for security. Permanent homes required both. Rooms were expanded, ceilings raised, decorative elements added. Private chambers became more private, communal spaces more comfortable. Ventilation systems that had been adequate for survival were upgraded for quality of life. The underground complexes grew more elaborate, even as their original defensive purpose receded. Historians still argue about the demographic patterns of semi-subterranean communities. Some evidence suggests that underground dwellers maintained good health and normal lifespans, their stable environments and reduced exposure to surface hazards balancing any disadvantages of cave living. Other evidence points to deficiency diseases, respiratory problems, and reproductive challenges. The data vary by period and region, and definitive conclusions remain elusive. One quirky aspect of permanent underground living involved light architecture. Simple lamp niches gave way to elaborate chandelier systems, mirrors that reflected and multiplied available light, positioning of reflective surfaces to channel daylight from entrances into interior spaces. The engineering of illumination became a specialty, and the most prosperous underground homes featured lighting that approached surface quality during daylight hours. Social structures adapted to the semi-subterranean lifestyle. Property rights in the underground space required definition. Who owned which chambers, how expansion requests were handled, what happened when the excavation from one property threatened another. Village governance extended beneath the surface, with authorities settling disputes and enforcing standards. The informal arrangements that worked during emergency periods formalized into permanent legal structures. Economic activities relocated partially or entirely underground. The tanneries of Nottingham we discussed earlier represent one pattern. Industries that benefited from the underground conditions moving there permanently. Wine production, mushroom cultivation, storage businesses, even some textile work operated better underground than above. Communities discovered competitive advantages in their cave dwellings and exploited them systematically. Religious practice continued to anchor underground life. The churches carved during refuge periods became parish churches for permanent communities. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, the markers of Christian life occurred in stone chambers rather than above-ground sanctuaries. Some communities built surface churches as their prosperity increased, but others retained their underground worship spaces, the connection to ancestral refuge carrying spiritual significance beyond architectural necessity. The children who grew up in permanent underground communities developed abilities their surface-dwelling neighbours lacked. Navigation in darkness came naturally. Comfort in enclosed spaces was normal. The skills that had been survival necessities became cultural inheritance, passed down without formal instruction simply through lived experience. These children could function above ground perfectly well, but underground was home. You imagine living in such a community now, descending at day's end into chambers that have sheltered your family for generations. Their stone walls bear the marks of great-grandparents you never met, their chisel strokes visible in the lamplight. Your children play in passages where you played, where your parents played before you. The surface is for work and trade and interaction with the wider world. Here in the carved stone is where life happens. The refuge became home, the emergency became normal, and the stone which once meant survival came to mean simply living. The last raid happened so long ago that only the oldest villagers remember it directly, and their memories have grown soft with retelling. The younger generation has heard the stories, everyone has heard the stories, but the reality feels distant, historical, something that happened to other people in other times. The underground passages still exist, their entrances still maintained, their rolling stones still functional. But no one seriously expects to use them. The world has changed. The decline of underground refuge usage across medieval Europe occurred gradually, driven by multiple factors that varied by region and period. Military technology evolved, political, structures consolidated, populations reorganized in ways that made the old patterns of raid and hide less relevant. The caves didn't disappear, stone lasts, but their purpose shifted from survival essential to historical curiosity to forgotten presence beneath the modern landscape. Centralized kingdoms provided security that village-level defense couldn't match. When royal authority could project military force throughout a territory, raiders faced consequences that self-help remedies never imposed. The protection wasn't perfect, and peasant communities still suffered during wars between states. But the endless small-scale predation that had made underground refugees essential decreased as state power increased. Villages that could count on distant authorities to eventually punish raiders needed to hide less desperately than villages entirely on their own. Castle construction absorbed resources that might otherwise have gone into underground refuges. The great stone fortifications, that arose across medieval Europe offered a different kind of protection, visible, impressive, capable of sheltering significant populations in concentrated defensive positions. Communities that had previously relied on dispersed hiding adopted strategies of concentrating around fortifications instead. The skills that had carved underground cities were redirected to build above-ground walls. Historians still argue about the relative importance of various factors in Russian underground refugee decline. Some emphasize military technology, the development of weapons and tactics that made underground defenses vulnerable. Others focus on demographic shifts, as populations move from vulnerable rural positions to better protected urban centres. Still others point to economic changes that made the investment in refuge maintenance less worthwhile compared to alternative uses of labour and resources. One quirky factor involved changing expectations about civilized warfare. As medieval societies developed increasingly elaborate rules about legitimate violence, who could be attacked, when, under what circumstances, the indiscriminate raiding that had driven refugee construction became less socially acceptable even when it remained physically possible. Raiders who violated emerging norms faced reputational consequences that purely practical raiders hadn't. The cultural environment grew slightly less hostile. The underground spaces didn't vanish. They simply found new purposes. Storage remained valuable. The cool, stable conditions that had preserved refugee supplies equally preserved merchant goods. Wine cellars expanded into former refuge chambers. Some spaces became ritual sites, their ancient character attracting religious or superstitious interest. Others were simply sealed and forgotten, their entrances blocked by construction, their existence dropping from living memory. Rediscovery sometimes happened dramatically. A farmer's plough breaking through a hidden sailing, a construction project exposing passages no one knew existed, a curious child exploring a rock formation and finding a doorway. These accidental discoveries revealed underground networks that communities had forgotten they possessed, architectural inheritance from ancestors whose names no one remembered. The transition from active use to abandonment varied enormously by location. Some Cappadocian communities maintained underground residence into the 20th century, others abandoned underground living centuries earlier. Some French troglodyte villages never stopped being troglodyte villages, their cave dwellings occupied continuously from medieval times to the present. The pattern wasn't uniform. Local circumstances determined local outcomes. You stand now at an entrance that hasn't been used for a generation. The stone still moves, the passage still descends, but the footprints in the dust are old. The emergency supplies have long since been removed, the oil lamps taken for other uses, the sleeping platforms bare. The refuge waits, as refugees must, for dangers that no longer come. Perhaps they never will again. Perhaps the world has genuinely changed enough that hiding underground belongs to history. Or perhaps the old villagers are right when they mutter that nothing truly changes, that the quiet times never last, that the passages should be kept clear, because someday someone will need them again. The entrance stone remains ready to roll. The passages remain passable. The refuge waits, just in case. The archaeologist's brush whisks across carved stone, revealing marks that haven't seen light in centuries. She's working in a passage discovered 3 years ago when construction crews broke through what they thought was solid rock and found instead a void, a darkness, a space that shouldn't exist beneath a modern Turkish housing development. The construction stopped. The excavation began. And now, metre by metre, the secrets of an underground community are emerging into contemporary knowledge. The rediscovery of medieval underground refugees occurred and continues to occur across the world, each revelation adding to our understanding of how desperate communities carved survival from stone. Some discoveries were made by scholars following clues in historical documents. Others happened entirely by accident. All contributed to a picture that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The systematic exploration of Cappadocian underground cities began in the early 20th century, though local inhabitants had always known some caves existed. French priest Guillaume de Gerfagnon conducted pioneering studies of the cave churches in the 1920s and 1930s, documenting frescoes and architectural features with the tools available at the time. Later researchers expanded to the secular complexes, revealing the full extent of underground construction. The process continues. New chambers are still being discovered in complexes that have been studied for decades. Derinkuyu's modern rediscovery illustrates the pattern. Local residents had always known about some underground chambers. They'd been using them as storage, as cool summer retreats, as escape from surface heat. But the full depth and complexity of the site emerged only when a homeowner knocked through a wall during renovations in '63 and found passages extending far beyond any previously suspected limits. Exploration revealed level after level, eventually documenting 18 stories of underground construction. Historians still argue about how much remains undiscovered. The known sites represent systematic survey efforts, but systematic surveys haven't covered all potentially relevant areas. Remote sensing technologies, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, aerial thermal imaging, reveal anomalies that suggest voids. But confirming underground spaces requires physical investigation that limited resources make impossible to conduct everywhere. Every decade brings new discoveries, suggesting that many more await. One quirky aspect of the underground archaeology involves preservation conditions. The stable temperatures and darkness that made underground refuges effective also preserve organic materials that would decay on the surface. Textiles, leather, wooden objects, food residues. These materials provide insights into daily life that stone structures alone can't convey. The underground sites are time capsules, sealed environments that maintained their contents across centuries. Modern tourism has transformed some underground sites, particularly in Cappadocia. Electric lighting, paved paths, explanatory signs, gift shops. The infrastructure of heritage tourism now occupies spaces once designed for desperate concealment. The economic benefits to local communities are substantial, but the transformation raises questions about authenticity and preservation. Sites that succeeded by being invisible are now marketed for visibility. Documentation technology has revolutionized underground archaeology. Three-dimensional scanning creates digital models of spaces impossible to physically preserve in original condition. Photogrammetry records surface details at resolution beyond human perception. Virtual reality allows scholars and public alike to experience underground environments without physical presence. The digital record will persist even as the physical sites deteriorate. The heritage interpretation of underground refuges has evolved over time. Early approaches emphasized engineering achievements. Look how cleverly they carved these spaces. Later interpretation recognized the human drama. These were hiding places for terrified families, not architectural showcases. Current best practice attempts to integrate both perspectives, honoring technical accomplishment while acknowledging the desperation that motivated it. You imagine yourself as that archaeologist, brush in hand, revealing carvings that no one has seen since the carver died. The marks tell stories in languages you've learned to read. Functional marks, here's a lamp niche, here's a water channel. Decorative marks, someone wanted this wall to be beautiful. Devotional marks, crosses, prayers, expressions of faith. Each mark represents a human decision, a human hand, a human dumb life now vanished but not quite gone. The stone remembers, your brush reveals, and the past speaks, if you know how to listen. The lessons emerge slowly, as lessons do when the teachers have been silent for centuries. You sit now with everything you've learned, the engineering and the desperation, the ingenuity and the suffering, the communities that carved survival from stone when no other survival seemed possible. What do the underground refugees tell us about who we are, about who we might become, about the eternal human search for safety in a dangerous world? They tell us first that hope persists even in hopelessness. The builders of underground cities couldn't know if their work would succeed. They couldn't predict which raids would come, how long they'd last, whether the refugees would hold. They built anyway. They carved passage after passage, chamber after chamber, preparing for futures they couldn't see. The faith required for that work, faith in the project, faith in the community, faith in tomorrow, represents something essential about human nature. We prepare. We plan. We act as if the future will come, even when the present suggests it might not. They tell us that community can accomplish what individuals cannot. No single family built Derinkuyu. No lone genius designed the Celtic souterrains. These were collective achievements, accumulated over generations, maintained by social bonds that transcended individual lifespans. The modern cult of individual achievement might take note. The most lasting human accomplishments arise from cooperation, not competition. The underground cities survived because communities built them, together and used them together. They tell us that adaptation is survival's essence. The underground communities didn't cling to surface ways of living. They invented new ways suited to new environments. Children learned new games. Religious practices found new forms. Economic activities discovered new advantages. The communities that thrived underground were those willing to change, to reimagine what life could be, to find possibility in circumstances that seemed to foreclose possibility. Historians still argue about the broader significance of underground refuge sites, whether they represent universal human patterns or merely specific cultural responses to specific historical circumstances. Both perspectives probably hold truth. The underground cities were products of particular times and places, shaped by geology and technology and social organisation that varied across regions, but the impulse beneath them, the determination to survive, to protect loved ones, to find safety, even when safety seems impossible, that impulse is universal. One final quirky thought. The underground refugees remind us that the ground beneath our feet holds stories we haven't heard yet. Every landscape conceals its past. Every hillside might contain passages. Every field might cover chambers. The medieval builders didn't advertise their work. Concealment was the whole point, and much of what they built remains undiscovered. The earth keeps secrets, patient as stone, waiting for the right combination of accident and attention to reveal what it holds. And now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts grow soft around the edges, let these ancient places rest easy in your mind. The torch flames that once lit desperate passages have long since flickered out. The voices that echoed through carved stone have faded into silence so complete it might be called peace. The communities that huddled in darkness, waiting for danger to pass, eventually emerged into sunlight that must have seemed unbearably bright and beautiful. The underground refugees still exist, most of them, patient beneath landscapes that have changed in every other way. The stone holds its shape. The passages remain passable. If you were to descend tomorrow into one of these ancient spaces, you would find the lamp niches waiting for flames, the storage chambers waiting for grain, the rolling stones waiting to seal passages against threats that no longer come. The infrastructure of survival stands ready, just in case. But you don't need to descend tonight. You're safe where you are, warm and comfortable. The dangers that drove medieval farmers underground as distant from your experience as the farmers themselves. The world has changed, mostly for the better, and the need to carve cities from stone has passed. At least for now, at least for you. Let yourself drift now, carried by the rhythm of your own breathing, by the comfort of your own bed, by the knowledge that humanity has always found ways to survive. The underground builders are long gone, but their legacy persists, the proof that determination and community can overcome almost anything. That lesson belongs to you now, a gift from ancestors you never met, carved in stone that will outlast us all. The lamp flickers, the shadows soften, the story ends where stories always end, in the gentle darkness before sleep, where everything makes a kind of sense that waking thought can't quite capture. The underground cities wait in that darkness, patient as they have always been, guarding their secrets and their lessons for anyone willing to listen. Rest now, the earth holds its children gently, and tomorrow the